Hey everyone, welcome back to Dark Sleep Radio. It's great to have you here where we explore encounters with mysterious beings from beyond our skies, perfect for helping you unwind and fall asleep. I'm eager to connect with you all, so drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from. Now, make sure you're comfy and let's jump into tonight's story. It was late September, just after the season's first chill had set in, which meant no more mosquitoes, but the lake water was still warm enough for bass fishing. My cousin Neil and I decided to spend the night fishing at Lake Etterton. We arrived at our favorite spot around 8 p.m. The lake, surrounded mostly by dense pine forests, is quite large but shallow. We parked Neil's truck on a gravel pull-off and walked about 20 yards through the trees to a clearing by the water. This wasn't an official campsite, just a spot with a log someone had dragged over to sit on, and we've been coming here for years. As we settled in, we set up our rods, opened a couple of beers, and started fishing with no particular expectations, just enjoying the moment. Around 10:30 p.m., something unusual happened. We were mostly sitting in silence, just the occasional chat, listening to the crickets and the sporadic splashes from the lake. The night was still, no wind, no noise from boats or animals, which wasn't unusual for that time. Suddenly, I noticed a strange glow through the trees on the other side of the lake. At first, I mistook it for the moon because of its soft white-blue light. However, when I looked up, the actual moon was clear and bright behind us. I nudged Neil and pointed towards the mysterious light. We sat there watching it in silence. The light appeared as a large orb about the size of a water tower and seemed to hover above the tree line across the lake. As we continued to watch, it became evident that it was moving, slowly and almost lazily drifting downwards. This glowing orb didn't behave like any typical light source. It didn't cast any shadows, nor did it disturb the water. It was completely silent and moved without a sound, just a steady drop, inch by inch through the night air. Neil whispered, "What the hell is that?" I had no idea. The light wasn't bright enough to be blinding, but it had a peculiar quality, almost as if it didn't belong in our world. It was neither a spotlight, a flare, and it was too smooth and slow-moving to be a drone. Nor did it blink like aircraft lights. It was just a perfect, dimly lit circle, out of place and mysterious. So that's what happened during our night at Lake Etterton. What do you think that light could have been? As it hovered just 10 feet above the pine trees, I watched it closely until it touched the treetops and then stopped. It was eerily quiet. I strained my ears hoping to catch a distant hum or the sound of animals reacting, but heard nothing. The crickets had stopped, and the lake was completely still, without even a breeze rustling the reeds. Then, the object sank straight down behind the trees. There was no wobble, no drift, just a slow, steady vertical descent until it vanished as if it had never been there at all. Immediately after, the light reflecting on the water disappeared too. Neil stood up abruptly and announced, "We should go." His voice wasn't fearful, just slightly disturbed. I felt it too, a primal instinct to leave, similar to realizing a thunderstorm is imminent and you're outside holding a metal rod. Though nothing dramatic had occurred, staying out there didn't feel right. We quickly packed up, silently tossing our gear into the backpacks and making sure we left no trash behind. Neil handled the tackle box, and I grabbed the rods. The walk back to the truck felt unusually long. I kept looking back into the trees, not sure what I was expecting to see. The moon still hung in the sky, but everything seemed to have lost its color. Everything felt darker. When we reached the truck, we paused for a moment before getting in. Neil asked whether I wanted to sleep in the cab or head home. "Let's drive," I chose. About 15 minutes into our drive on a deserted 2-lane road, the dashboard lights flickered, the radio cut out momentarily, and the headlights dimmed as if the battery was failing. Neil hit the dashboard, and everything flickered back to life. He tried to laugh it off, but gave me a look that seemed to ask if I was going to comment. We spent the rest of the ride home in silence. It wasn't until the next day when I brought it up again that Neil shared he had experienced something similar years ago while fishing with his dad near that same lake. He described seeing a similar soft glowing ball that hovered and then disappeared into the woods without a trace. He shrugged when I asked why he never mentioned it before, simply saying, It didn't seem real. That resonated with me because that's exactly how our experience felt, like something that was and then wasn't. A few weeks later, I returned to that spot during the day just to look around. The trees across the lake looked the same. There were no signs of burns or disturbances. I was on duty in the north section of the preserve, doing trail checks in the middle of winter. It was mid-January, and the temperature had plummeted to about -10 overnight. Most of the park was shut down, very few visitors around, except for some die-hard snowshoers and backcountry campers. It was eerily quiet. My shift kicked off before sunrise. With a thermos of coffee and the truck's heater cranked up, I drove along the service road by Thompson Lake, which is usually frozen from December through March. That morning, there wasn't much wind, just a dry, biting cold with a pale pink glow beginning to light up behind the ridge. I stopped the truck at a pull-off to scan the area. The snow was undisturbed, covering everything in a thick white blanket. No tracks from rabbits or coyotes. Nothing. I checked the trees with my binoculars and then looked out over the lake. What I saw was puzzling. Hovering about 10 or 15 feet above the ice was something odd. Not touching the ice, just floating there. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light or some fog, which can happen around dawn. But it was clear this was no fog. It wasn't moving or drifting. It was a solid, oval or disc-like shape, metallic-looking, catching the early light with a faint glint like brushed aluminum. No lights, no sound, no markings. It was just there in the air, about 50 yards from the shore. Rooted to the spot, I watched in silence for a few moments, trying to make sense of it. It didn't wobble, shift, rise, or fall. It was as if someone had hit pause on a drone in mid-flight, but there was no humming, no buzzing, just complete silence. I walked slowly down the slope towards the lake. The snow was knee-deep in places, but untouched. I expected the object to move, disappear, or change, but it didn't. It just stayed there, floating. Later, I ventured through the woods on the far side where the light had vanished. It was muddy, full of leaves and thorns. I found no tracks, no damage, no signs that anyone else had been out there. Since that night, I haven't gone night fishing. I'm not really scared. I just haven't felt like it. We never saw it again. I was only about 20 feet from the lake's edge, close enough to notice an odd ripple of distortion surrounding an object above the ice. It was eerily similar to the way heat wafts from hot pavement, yet the temperature was well below freezing. The light seemed to warp strangely around it. I lifted my binoculars for a closer look, but before I could even focus, the object vanished. It didn't zoom away, it simply ceased to exist. One moment it hovered there, and the next, it was as if it had been. There was no sound, no trail of motion, not even a stir of breeze. Just the empty air and the wide expanse of ice. I remained there for some time, hoping it might reappear or show up somewhere else along the lake. But there was nothing. All was silent and cold. Even the trees across the lake stood unmoved. I thought it might have been a drone, perhaps a new type that I hadn't seen before, possibly from one of the research teams that occasionally passed through. But drones usually make some noise, or at least have a mechanical presence. This had nothing like that. After waiting with no further signs, I stepped onto the lake. The ice beneath my feet was thick, at least 8 inches, probably more. I know that lake well. I've walked it every winter for years and can spot unsafe ice. This ice was solid. I walked right to where the object had been, but there was no evidence of disturbance. No cracks, no unusual frost patterns, no melted spots, and certainly no impact marks. It was as if the ice had remained perfectly undisturbed throughout the season. Even the snow around the spot was pristine, untouched, with no signs of displacement or disturbance. Curious, I crouched down and brushed off some snow with my glove, feeling the ice. It was cold, solid, clean. Then I noticed my radio wasn't working. It's a standard issue two-way, reliable even in dense forests. But when I tried to check in with dispatch, all I got was static. No signal bars. Turning it off and on didn't help. My phone was no better. It wouldn't unlock at first, and when it finally did, the clock had reset to 12 a.m., the screen lagged terribly, and then it shut off completely, despite having a full battery. Feeling uneasy, I left the lake and made my way back to my truck, which I'd left idling. When I climbed in, the dashboard clock showed 7:14. The experience left me puzzled, unable to explain what had happened or what I had seen, or thought I'd seen, hovering above the ice. I was cruising east on Route 62 through the Mojave, headed toward 29 Palms. It was past midnight, and the roads were empty, the desert pitch black except for the area lit by my headlights. The only signs of life were the occasional road signs, looking like relics from the 60s. I wasn't rushing, just driving a bit over the speed limit, sipping warm coffee, and lost in my thoughts in the dead of night. The air was still, as if the entire desert had fallen asleep. That's when I noticed something strange after mile marker 128. Another day, back at my job at the park, I was driving down a trail when suddenly the radio in my truck started acting up. It blinked a few times, and then the screen just went black. The engine was fine, but the electronics weren't behaving right. I parked for a minute, trying to figure it out, but nothing made sense. With no trust in the vehicle's systems, I drove slowly back towards the ranger station. Halfway there, without warning, the radio and phone snapped back to life with full reception. However, the clock was off by exactly 20 minutes. I returned and recorded the morning as routine in the logs. I mentioned an unconfirmed visual anomaly over Thompson Lake, but left out the part about the electronics. Later that week, I returned to the same spot under identical conditions, this time with a thermal scope. I checked the lake from every angle, but there was nothing. No object, no interference, just the usual wind and snow and some elk prints by the lake. I stood where I had before, looking out towards the tree line, trying to recreate the moment to see if I had missed something like a reflective surface or hidden equipment. But still, nothing. In my 10 years working at the park, I've seen strange things, unexplained lights, odd sounds reported by hikers, even a radio tower that turned back on after being decommissioned. But nothing ever came close to what Har peened that morning. It was quiet and unsettling. Now, whenever I'm up there, I habitually check the lake, always early in the morning just before sunrise. Yet, whatever it was hasn't appeared again. Driving down the highway, I noticed something unusual just to the left of the road. Initially, I dismissed it as a reflection on my windshield or a glare from the dashboard. However, it became clear that what I was seeing wasn't just a trick of light. There were 3 dim white lights arranged in a perfect triangle, 2 at the front and 1 at the back, hovering a few hundred feet off the road. These lights were definitely below the mountain line and seemed to be moving at the same pace as my car. Curious, I slowed down, thinking it might be an aircraft heading towards the nearby airstrip, or perhaps a drone. But as I adjusted my speed, the lights maintained their distance and alignment perfectly, never getting any closer or changing angles. They stayed just out of reach of my headlights, glowing steadily like halogen bulbs seen through frosted glass without flickering or changing color. I rolled down the window and leaned out, hoping to catch the sound of rotor blades or an engine. But there was nothing, no hum of electricity or mechanical noise, just the sound of my tires on the pavement and the wind. It was eerily silent. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see another vehicle, but the road behind me remained empty. The longer I drove, the more unsettling it felt. The lights just persistently there, as if watching or waiting. Trying to rationalize, I told myself it could be a military exercise from the nearby 29 Palms base. But having lived in the area for years, I knew the sounds and sights of helicopters and jets, and this was different. There were no typical markers like strobe lights, no red or green navigation lights, and no change in altitude, just a smooth, silent glide. Around mile 135, driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, I turned off my headlights for a moment. My brights had been illuminating dust in the air, and I wondered if I was imagining things. But the lights were still visible, hanging quietly in the darkness. Quickly, I turned the headlights back on. While I wasn't exactly scared, seeing those lights persist without any logical explanation made me feel vulnerable. I slowed down to a crawl and pulled off the road, still pondering the silent, mysterious lights that had accompanied me. I stopped my car on a wide patch of dirt shoulder, and as I did, the lights in the sky also came to a halt. They were still hovering, glowing faintly in the shape of a triangle, not moving any closer or farther from where they had been. I killed the engine and stepped out into the desert's eerie silence, a quiet so profound my ears rang from the lack of sound. The sky was peppered with stars. For a moment, I lost sight of the lights as they blended into the celestial backdrop, but then I spotted them again, in the same spot, maintaining the same formation about 50 feet off the ground, perfectly still. I waited there for any sign of change, a movement, a sound, anything, but they remained stationary. Curious, I took a few steps toward them, moving from the gravel shoulder onto the scrubby desert terrain. That's when the lights began to glide sideways, keeping their formation intact, drifting to the left as if sliding along an invisible track. I stopped moving, and so did they. That's when I noticed something else unusual, the absence of any animal sounds. Normally, you'd hear coyotes or insects, maybe the occasional rustle in the brush, but not this time. It was as if the area around the lights had entered a sort of stasis. There wasn't even the sound of the wind. Feeling uneasy, I backed toward my car, got in, and drove back onto the highway. The lights resumed following me, maintaining the same distance as before. I watched them from my window, then in the rearview mirror, and then from the passenger side when they shifted to the right side of the road. As I drove past a cluster of old trailers and shacks, about a dozen of them, all dark and always a bit creepy even in daylight, the lights suddenly blinked out. They didn't fade or streak, they just disappeared. 1 second they were there, the next they were gone. I pulled over again, got out, and looked around. There was nothing but the desert and the stars. I continued driving, now more slowly, scanning the sky and the landscape, until I reached 29 Palms around 2 a.m. I stopped at a gas station just to stand under the bright lights and hear something human. I kept the experience to myself for a while, didn't report it. What could I say? There were no markings, no details I could describe, just 3 white lights forming a triangle in the dark, moving silently beside me for 10 miles, as if they knew my exact speed. I never saw it land or take off. It was just there, and then it wasn't. It started right after dinner, around 8:30 p.m. It wasn't exactly loud, more like a deep, constant hum you could feel in your chest if you really paid attention. Jess, my wife, noticed it first while she was cleaning up the kitchen. She paused, peered out the window, and asked, "Do you hear that?" I brushed it off initially, thinking it might be the wind or a distant plane. Curious, we both stepped outside. Our farmhouse and a barn are a bit isolated, with nothing but clear skies and stars above us that night. No planes, no clouds, no blinking lights, just an eerie silence and that strange hum. It felt like it was moving, gliding right above the ground, or just skimming it. That's when things took a weird turn. Looking over at the barn, I noticed something off about the shadows. The floodlights cast shadows from the barn beams and nearby trees in various directions. But now, every shadow was aligned the same way, pointing toward the northwest corner of our property. It was as though all the lights had been mysteriously re-angled without anyone touching them. Jess caught on too and muttered, "That's not right." We just stood there trying to make sense of it all, but couldn't. The hum lingered for about a minute before it abruptly stopped. Immediately, the shadows returned to their normal positions, as if nothing had happened. But nobody was there. It was just us, the crickets, and an owl in the distance. I walked around the barn's perimeter, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. No cars, no movement, nothing. Trying to reassure Jess, I suggested it might be something electrical, like a transformer. We do have a power pole about 100 yards away, and sometimes they make a humming noise. But I had never heard anything like this before, and the way those shadows shifted just didn't make sense. That night, I hardly slept. That humming noise seemed to echo in my mind, stuck on repeat. I told Jess, but neither of us had any real answers. It was just one of those things, unexplained and unsettling. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the barn. The floodlights were working fine, and everything looked normal. I inspected the area for any unusual signs, like tracks, marks on the ground, or broken branches. However, the dirt was dry and undisturbed. Curious, I asked a neighbor if he had noticed anything odd recently, but he hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. It seemed like the strange occurrences were localized to my property and happened in just a fleeting moment. Over the following days, a few odd things continued to happen. my usually calm dog, Sam, started acting weird around the barn after dark. He would growl and fix his gaze toward the northwest corner of the barn, as if he saw something I couldn't. My wife, Jess, mentioned feeling like someone was watching her whenever she hung laundry in our backyard. Because of these unsettling feelings, I began locking our doors earlier in the evening and double-checking the windows before going to bed. One evening, while I was fixing a loose board by the barn, I heard a low, faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on metal. The taps were irregular and seemed to come from behind the barn, an area with just old equipment and storage. I called out to Jess to come listen. However, the moment she turned on her flashlight and aimed it in the direction of the sound, it stopped abruptly. We searched the area but found no evidence of anyone's presence, no footprints or disturbed objects. That night, I tried to record the area with my phone, hoping to capture any unusual sounds. Unfortunately, the recording only picked up the normal sounds of the night. The audio was clean, with no humming, tapping, or other strange noises. Despite this, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease, as if something unseen was lurking just out of sight. On the third night, both Jess and I heard the hum again. It started quietly and gradually grew louder, similar to a distant engine revving up, and this time it caused the whole house to vibrate slightly. With flashlight in hand, I went outside to investigate. I noticed all shadows in the yard were stretching toward the northwest corner. As I walked closer to the area, the air felt colder and heavier, almost as if the night itself was denser. Jess stayed inside, but I continued toward the northwest corner, shining my light around the trees and old tractor parts. There was nothing visibly out of place. Eventually, the hum faded and the shadows returned to normal. The abrupt silence felt overwhelming. I stood in the darkness for a long moment, feeling exposed and alert. I woke up in the dead of night, guessing it was around 2 or 3 a.m., because my watch and phone were dead. They wouldn't turn on, no matter how many buttons I pressed, as if their batteries had simply vanished. My headlamp was just as unresponsive, even though I'd loaded it with fresh batteries before my trip. This eerie quiet was the second odd thing that struck me. I've camped alone for many years and know the usual sounds of the woods at night. The wind, a creaking branch, distant owls, or even just my own breathing. But that night, there was absolute silence, like someone had pressed mute on the whole forest. Cautiously, I unzipped my tent and stepped out, barefoot and using only the moonlight to see. The night was crisp, carrying that sharp chill just before a frost sets in. My earlier campfire was out, leaving behind nothing but cold, blackened coals and a few logs that felt strangely icy. Looking up, the sky was clear with stars scattered across it, but they looked wrong. I'm no expert on constellations, but I could usually spot Orion, the Big Dipper, and Cassiopeia. That night, none of them were in their usual places. The whole sky seemed rearranged, with some stars appearing too close together and others too far apart. It felt as though the stars had been pulled inward, making the sky look unnaturally tight. I kept an eye on the northwest corner of the farm after that experience. The hum and shifting shadows never returned, and everything stayed normal. But whenever I passed that corner after dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, something that didn't want to be noticed. I've thought about it a lot. Maybe it was some odd interference from power lines or something else natural that I just don't understand. But deep down, I know it wasn't anything natural. All I know for sure is that after that night, a quiet feeling lingered over the farm. It was as if something had watched us for a moment and then decided to vanish. I was out in the woods when something strange happened. I touched one of the trees and immediately pulled back my hand. It wasn't because the tree was hot, but shockingly, it was icy cold, colder than the ground around it, as if it had been encased in ice. I moved away from the clearing and stood at the edge of the trees, peering into the forest. The silence was unnerving. To break it, I clapped my hands. The sound echoed back weirdly, as if the trees were much further away, coming back to me dull and distorted, like it traveled through a vast empty hall. That's when I noticed something off about the shadows. Instead of falling behind me where the moon was, the shadows from the trees in front stretched towards me, suggesting there was another light source deeper in the forest. I spun around, half expecting to find someone else there, maybe a late hiker or someone playing with a drone. But there was nothing, just the dark clearing, my tent, and a sky that looked unfamiliar. Feeling uneasy, I walked back to my tent to grab my backup flashlight, a wind-up model that didn't need batteries. I cranked it hard for about 30 seconds, but when I switched it on, nothing happened. It was as if the bulb was missing. I checked the connections and even swapped out the bulb from my lantern, but still, nothing worked. Next, I tried the lantern itself, which ran on C batteries, but it wouldn't turn on either. I pulled out the batteries, turning them over in my palm. They were room temperature, not warm, not drained, just inert. It felt as though all my equipment had been neutralized, not broken or fried, but somehow turned off in an inexplicable way. I wasn't exactly scared, not yet, but I definitely felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. It was similar to the feeling you get when you realize someone has been rifling through your belongings. Nothing overtly wrong, but something subtly off. About 15 minutes later, what I thought was wind began. The pine trees swayed slightly, but eerily, there was no sound. No whispering leaves, no creaking branches, nothing. It was like watching a muted video. Standing there in the clearing, watching this silent display, I couldn't shake the feeling of being on edge. As I stood silently on the north side of the Eagle River Trail, not far from where the main path divides and begins its climb toward the overlook, I realized something was off. It was early September, the air cool but pleasant, and the sky mostly clear. The trail I had followed and seemed narrower than before, as if the trees alongside it had inched closer together overnight. The surrounding brush looked oddly flattened, suggesting something large might have recently passed through, a detail I hadn't noticed the day before. Turning slowly in a circle to get my bearings, I noticed the grass under my feet didn't make a sound as I moved. I walked about 10 feet down the trail and then stopped abruptly, sensing a strange pressure in the air. It wasn't wind or any audible noise, but a heavy, dense feeling, as if the air itself had thickened. My ears began to ring slightly, similar to the sensation you feel in a descending airplane. Looking up, the stars appeared brighter than usual, and the sky near the horizon had a greenish tint, reminiscent of the aurora borealis, yet eerily still. That's when the soft, irregular clicking began. It sounded like a small pebble gently tapping against wood, but there was no rhythm to it, just a few clicks, then silence, and then a few more. I spun around, half expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing. The clicking seemed to come from all directions, possibly even from beneath the ground. Nervously, I backed toward my tent, anticipating something to emerge from the dark woods, but nothing appeared. Gradually, the clicking faded, as if moving away or perhaps just sinking deeper into the earth. About 10 minutes later, the heavy feeling in the air lifted, the normal night sounds resumed, and my phone vibrated, in my pocket. I pulled it out to find it rebooting as if it had been turned off, although the battery showed 87%. My headlamp flicked back on, casting a steady, bright white light, as if nothing unusual had happened. My watch still read midnight, and I wouldn't have any phone signal until mid-morning the next day, but all my equipment seemed to function properly. I packed up at sunrise, skipping breakfast, eager to leave. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the fire pit, watching the stars slowly return to their normal positions in the sky. After a tough work week, I decided to go for a solo hike one afternoon. I just wanted to stretch my legs a bit, nothing too strenuous, planning only a simple out and back before dusk. About 2 hours into the hike, I paused near a switchback to drink some water and admire the view. The valley below with its deep greens and blues seemed almost unreal, with only the sound of the wind and a distant creek breaking the silence. While I was enjoying the peace, something caught my eye across the valley behind the far ridge. It was a small, sudden glint, like sunlight reflecting off metal. At first, I thought it might be a plane, but it didn't move horizontally. Instead, it ascended slowly, straight up. As I watched, a silver, smooth object that resembled a flattened pill shape, without any wings or rotors, emerged. It rose steadily, as if pulled by an invisible wire, completely silent. I was so stunned that I froze, my water bottle halfway to my mouth, and just stared as the object climbed about 300 or 400 feet above the ridge and then stopped. It just hovered there. Out of habit, I glanced at my watch. It was 4:42 p.m. Barely 5 seconds later, the object shot straight up into the sky, silently and swiftly disappearing into the blue, like a stone dropping into deep water. The quiet returned as if nothing had happened. No echoes, no wind stirring, no birds disturbed from their perches. Everything was as it had been, eerily normal. I stayed there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but there wasn't much to go on. It didn't resemble any drone or balloon I'd seen back in Anchorage, and I couldn't think of any man-made object that moved in such a way. Despite feeling a mix of weirdness and curiosity, I wasn't scared. I continued hiking towards the ridge, not really expecting to find anything, but driven by a sort of autopilot curiosity about the strange event. About 30 minutes later, higher up and in roughly the same direction, I stopped to have a protein bar. That's when I noticed something odd about my watch. It read 73, which made absolutely no sense at all. I checked my phone again to make sure of the time. It was 7:03. The sun hung lower than it should have, casting long shadows. I wondered how long I'd been walking. It felt like just an hour since sunrise, maybe less, but somehow 2 hours had slipped by. I hadn't stopped, sat, or zoned out. I'd been moving steadily. Yet now I was behind schedule and realized I'd need to jog part of the way back to avoid the dark. As I stood there, a sense of unease began to creep in, more intense than before. I noticed the silence around me. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of the wind. It was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Then, a sharp crack of a stick breaking echoed from about 20 feet behind me on the trail. I spun around, half expecting to see a deer or another hiker, but there was nothing. Just empty trail and still trees. I waited for a bit, then decided it was time to pick up the pace. I didn't run, but I wasn't dawdling either, and I kept glancing back every few minutes. Although I've hiked this trail many times and usually feel at ease, today was different. Something felt off. About halfway back, I stopped at the same overlook where I had first seen it. The sun had dipped further. The air had grown cooler. Looking toward the ridge, I saw it again, the same silver shape, descending slowly in a controlled manner, not falling. It was around the same height as before, just a few 100 feet above the ridge, descending into the same spot from which it had risen. I watched intently, not blinking, convinced of its reality. It disappeared behind the trees and didn't reappear. I waited, listening for any sound, a branch snapping, an engine, a door shutting, but heard nothing, only more of that profound silence stretched around me. Eventually, I resumed walking, my legs heavy. My mind wasn't on what I had seen anymore. I just focused on getting back before it got dark, feeling a buzz in my head like I'd skipped a meal. I remember lacing up my running shoes around 8:45 that evening, needing to clear my head after a long day. The sun had just set, leaving a cool crispness in the air, typical of early fall. I hit the pavement without music, just my watch to keep track of distance, pace, and time. My usual route takes me through quiet neighborhoods with decent sidewalks and little traffic. I glanced at my watch as I stepped off my driveway. It was 8:52 p.m. I planned to be back by 9:30, 9:40 at the latest, since I had work the next morning. The first quarter of my run was uneventful. I followed my typical path, down Hawthorne, left at the gas station, past the laundromat, and then into the residential area. It's a straightforward route that I had been running for over a year. By the time I reached a little four-way stop where Willow bends into Hollow Creek Road, it was around 9:10. Nothing unusual about the spot, just a stop sign, a street lamp, and a mail cluster for a nearby cul-de-sac. I remember seeing a kid on a scooter nearly crash at the curb, his mom close behind, scolding him to slow down. Later, when I got to the trailhead, I noticed only 2 cars in the parking lot. One was mine, and the other bore Washington plates with no one inside. The area was deserted, and the air carried a faint metallic scent, maybe from the creek or the soil. I sat in my car for a while, not ready to leave, not checking my phone or taking any pictures. I couldn't, or maybe didn't want to, explain what I had seen. The drive home was silent, devoid of traffic. I found myself watching the treetops in the rearview mirror more than the road ahead. That night, sleep barely came. My mind replayed the precise movements, how it returned to the same spot 2 hours later, as if nothing had happened. I've been back to that hiking spot since, but never alone. Though I haven't seen anything similar since then, the memory of that lost time lingers without explanation. Both my watch and phone showed the same time. It wasn't a dead battery or a glitch. Just 2 hours, gone. I always take the same left past the duplexes, then veer right by the dog park, which was unusually empty and quiet that day. About 5 minutes later, I found myself at the same intersection I had passed earlier. Confused, I figured I must have taken a wrong turn or doubled back without realizing it. But that didn't seem right. I knew the route like the back of my hand. It's a straight shot with a big curve, definitely not a loop. There's no way to end up back at Willow and Hollow Creek without making a deliberate U-turn. Standing under the street lamp, I tried to make sense of it. Everything was exactly the same. The dented stop sign, the flickering light above with a faint buzz I only now noticed. Glancing at my watch, it read 9:17. Thinking I might have zoned out, I decided to pay more attention this time. I retraced my steps, passing the duplexes and the dog park, taking a sharp right onto Linen Street, expecting to come out near the shopping center. Instead, I ended up right back at the same intersection of Willow and Hollow Creek. It was my third time there. This time, I stopped unning and just stood in the road, looking around. The street was deserted, no cars, no porch lights. The houses looked still. The buzzing from the street lamp grew louder. It was now 9:24 according to my watch. I opted to walk instead, hoping it might help change things. Running seemed to make it all feel more surreal, like being stuck on a never-ending loop. I walked to the next block, turned left, then left again, and continued straight, heading away from my usual path. This detour took me past brick homes with neatly trimmed hedges, a church I didn't recognize, and an empty lot surrounded by a chain-link fence. None of this should have been on my regular route. I wondered if I had accidentally wandered into a different neighborhood, but the street names were still the same as those I saw 20 minutes earlier. Eventually, I ended up back at Willow and Hollow Creek. It was my fourth time at the same intersection, but this time there was a difference. A black lab sat under the mailbox, staring at me. It didn't bark or growl, nor did it move. It just sat there perfectly still. I stepped under the street lamp, and this time, the light was steady and bright, shining like a spotlight. Glancing at my watch, it read 11:38. I blinked, thinking my watch was glitching. I tapped the side button, but the time stayed the same, showing it was 2 hours later than when my run began. That's when I noticed how sore my legs were, feeling as though I had been running non-stop for those 2 hours. My shirt was soaked and my throat was parched, yet I hadn't noticed these changes as they happened. Turning around, I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The houses seemed too quiet, their windows dark and unwelcoming. There wasn't a sound to be heard, no insects, no cars, not even the wind or my footsteps. It was eerily silent. I realized then that the dog that had been with me was gone without a trace. I couldn't remember seeing it leave. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. The street was just as I had found it, the mailbox untouched, and the hum from the street lamp now seemed to come from behind me, though it was still overhead. Feeling too winded to run, and with a gut feeling telling me not to, I started walking quickly. I turned down an unfamiliar road, then another, and yet another. No cars drove by, no porch lights flickered on. Suddenly, I found myself in front of the gas station near my house, a route that didn't make sense based on the turns I had taken off Willow onto Blue Jay Lane, a street that doesn't connect to the main road. But there it was, the gas station, buzzing with its usual fluorescent glow. One car was at the pump and an old guy was inside paying. As I crossed the lot and stood under the awning, the guy exiting the store gave me a strange look, likely because I was dripping with sweat and just standing there. I didn't buy anything, just walked home, which took about 5 minutes. Once home, I dropped my keys on the counter and checked my phone. It was 11:48, matching my watch. After a shower, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, barely sleeping that night. The next morning, I synced my watch with my running app. It recorded a total running time of 2 hours and 49 minutes, with multiple split segments logged, but none of it made any sense. The GPS path showed me running in circles around a 4-block area repeatedly, something it had never done before. Since then, nothing like that night has happened again. I still run, but I keep to the daytime and haven't gone down Willow since. I had just walked in the door from work around 6 p.m. when I noticed the sky had turned that eerie greenish hue that usually signals a storm brewing. The atmosphere felt dense, almost as if it were pressing down on my house. Living on the outskirts of town, where the street lights are sparse and the power lines hang low, I'm ed to the weather hitting us particularly hard. As the wind started to pick up, I managed to grill a quick dinner. By the time I sat down to eat, rain was already tapping against the windows, with the sky lighting up every few seconds due to the lightning. There wasn't much thunder initially, just continuous flashes that brightened the entire sky momentarily, like a giant camera flash. Around 7 p.m., the power stuttered and then failed completely. In the sudden darkness, I sat with my plate, listening to the wind violently pushing against the house. I wasn't too concerned. Power outages are fairly common here, especially when storms cause the trees to fall. Using my phone as a flashlight, I cleaned up the kitchen. After finishing, I stepped out onto the porch for a smoke. The rain had let up slightly, but thick clouds still loomed overhead, intermittently illuminated by the storm. I've always been drawn to storms, finding a certain peace in the way the wind and distant thunder override all other sounds. During one of these flashes, I spotted something unusual in the clouds. It wasn't flat like a plane, but more rounded, almost capsule-shaped. What caught my attention wasn't just its shape, it was the color. This object glowed with a dull silver light, seemingly from within, unlike anything metallic reflecting light. The glow had a gentle pulse, almost as if it were breathing. For about 30 seconds, I watched it, mesmerized. Even as the sky flashed again, the object remained stationary, unaffected by the storm. I initially thought it might be a trick of the storm, perhaps a drone or a balloon. However, it was unlike any drone I'd seen, lacking blinking lights and not swaying in the turbulent air. Its smooth, clean appearance set it further apart from any typical flying object I knew. Curiosity piqued, I went back inside to grab my binoculars. As I watched, a light in the clouds caught my eye. It pulsed, not regularly, but in a rhythm that seemed almost intentional. It would dim and then suddenly brighten to a near white hot before returning to a softer silver glow. This wasn't like any machine-generated light I'd seen before. Then it began to rotate slowly, with a quiet, steady motion that seemed like it was adjusting its position. But there was no sound accompanying this movement. No rumbling or wind shifting, nothing. The only response was the sudden standing of the hair on my arms, a sign of the eerie silence and the strange, low pressure filling the air, as if something massive had passed by silently. Taking a cautious step back from the porch rail, I noticed the absence of usual night sounds. No crickets chirping, no frogs, just the raindrops falling off the roof and that mysterious quiet glow pulsing in the distance. I retreated into the house without slamming the door, just gently closing it behind me. From the living room window, I could still see the glow through the trees, unchanged and softly luminous. It remained in the same spot for about 5 more minutes, and I just watched, captivated. Then suddenly, it began to fade. Not abruptly, but gradually, as if being absorbed by the clouds themselves, until it completely disappeared. Almost immediately after the light vanished, the normal sounds of a storm resumed. The thunder roared back to life, the wind whipped up, and rain lashed down heavily. A branch struck the roof, the porch light flickered before stabilizing, and the crickets resumed their nighttime song. It felt as if the storm had been on pause, and now everything had catapulted back to its natural, chaotic state. The power returned around 11 p.m., but sleep eluded me. I spent most of the night peering out the window at the clouds, half expecting to see something unusual again. The next morning, still intrigued by the previous night's events, I drove to the store and stopped for gas. I casually asked the attendant if the storm had caused the power outage everywhere. He confirmed that the whole area was affected and mentioned that a couple of transformers had blown after being struck by lightning. They were just 2 streets over from my house. Curious, I drove by them and saw one of the poles scorched and blackened, as if burned from the inside, with no trees around that could have caused such damage. I wondered if anyone else had noticed anything unusual in the sky during the storm. When I asked the attendant, he simply replied, "Weird how?" Unsure of how to explain without sounding outlandish, I just shrugged it off and said, "Never mind." I was on my way back from Vermont, having visited my sister, who just welcomed her second child. I'd spent a few days there helping out and left her place around 7 p.m., hoping to dodge the bulk of the weekend traffic. It was late October, and darkness fell quickly. As I navigated the back roads near the New Hampshire border, I found myself alone on the road. This particular stretch before hitting I-89 is surrounded by dense woods, with no gas stations, no shoulder, and barely any signs. Although it's not exactly a back road, it has that secluded feel with its 2 lanes and cracked pavement. The faded white lines on the road were nearly invisible in the dim light. I had the windows up, the music turned down low, focusing on staying alert. At 9:17 p.m., I glanced at the dash clock. Shortly after, I thought I heard a noise. It wasn't the music. It seemed to come from outside. I paused the track and rolled down the window slightly. Initially, all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees, but then the sound came again, clearer this time. It was a high-pitched crying, like that of a child or possibly a woman, emanating from the woods to the right of the road. Driven by instinct, I slowed the car. The area was devoid of other vehicles, houses, or even driveways. I continued at a reduced pace until I reached a small gravel area, possibly used for turning around or parking during a hunt, and pulled over. With the engine still running, I cracked open the door to listen. The crying was consistent, not fluctuating like typical sobbing, but repeating in a steady loop every few seconds. Standing with one foot on the pavement and the other on the gravel, I was hit by the strangeness of the situation. There was no logical reason for anyone to be out there, yet the thought of a lost child in the cold was alarming. I fetched the flashlight from the glove box and stepped a bit closer to the tree line, not venturing into the woods, but close enough to hear better. Abruptly, the crying stopped. I waited, half expecting a call for help or some sign of presence, but nothing followed. The silence was complete. Reflecting on that night, I realized nothing about it ever appeared in the news. No reports of weather anomalies or other incidents. No one else seems to have heard or seen anything. I haven't encountered anything similar since, but the memory of that glowing shape stays with me. It crosses my mind more often than I'd care to admit. It was completely still outside. No wind, no bugs, even the leaves were motionless. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. My name, Lena, called out just like the crying I'd heard earlier, only now it was clearly calling to me in the exact same tone. That moment, everything felt wrong in a way I couldn't really put into words. I wasn't deep in the woods. The voice was closer, clearer, and not shouting from afar. It seemed to be coming from right above me. Glancing upwards, I flashed my light into the trees. My hands shook a bit. I was trying to stay cool, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The flashlight's beam revealed nothing but the leaves that started rustling as a breeze picked up. Then my name came again, Lena, in that same unnerving, even tone. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound natural. Instinctively, I stepped backward toward my car, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. I glanced at the road. It was empty, just as I remembered it, but I had this overwhelming feeling that I needed to leave, not stay and investigate or try to help. I hurried back to the car, slammed the door, and didn't even bother to check the mirror as I sped away. I left the window cracked slightly. Part of me needed to know if that sound would follow me. For about a mile, everything was quiet. Then, as I rounded a bend, I heard it again. Lena, fainter this time, as if it hadn't followed me, but was still out there, hanging above somewhere, not echoing like a bird call, just present and then gone. I drove straight to a gas station near the interstate. Parking under the bright lights by the pumps, I just sat there with the engine running. I didn't go inside or fill up. I just needed to be in a bright, human place. Eventually, I went home but didn't talk about it right away. It wasn't that I thought people would laugh. I just had no idea how to explain that it wasn't what I saw that scared me, but where the sound came from. Later, I checked a map. There were no trails, no campgrounds near that spot, just dense forest. A week later, I had to drive that way again for work, but I deliberately took a longer route to avoid that road. I haven't been back since. That night, As I sat in the living room with some forgettable show playing on mute, just for background noise, my wife had already gone to bed. I was alone with my thoughts, replaying the eerie experience in my mind. Our baby monitor wasn't the fanciest on the market, but it did the job. It had a video screen, and we'd clipped the camera to the curtain rod in our daughter's room to keep an eye on her. She was usually a great sleeper and had gone down without a fuss at about 9:30 that evening. I was lounging on the couch, half watching TV and half watching the monitor, glancing over every few minutes out of habit. The monitor gave a grainy, grayscale night vision feed. You couldn't see fine details, just shapes and movements, but it was enough. Around 11:10, something odd caught my eye. In the upper right corner of the screen, there was a faint shape. At first, I thought it might just be a glare or a reflection, because occasionally the camera picked up car headlights from the street, even though our house was in a cul-de-sac where not much traffic came through. However, this shape didn't move like light. It seemed to hover near the window, looking like a smudge or a pale outline, too large to be a bug and not flickering like the passing of a car. Curious, I leaned in closer and adjusted the monitor towards me. The shape became a bit more defined, still not clear, but with edges. It resembled a person's shoulder, or maybe the side of a head, faintly visible as if behind a foggy layer. I kept watching, trying to convince myself it was maybe just the curtain caught weirdly by the night vision, creating an illusion. I got up and tiptoed to the bottom of the stairs to listen. The house was silent. Not wanting to wake up the baby, just to check on a probably harmless anomaly, I returned to the couch. The shape hadn't moved, but then subtly it did. It shifted slightly, as if leaning forward. Strangely, the curtain it was near didn't stir at all. The fabric was perfectly still, though the shape moved. I cranked up the volume on the monitor to catch any sound, rustling, breathing, anything. But there was silence. My heart raced a bit as I stared at the screen. I kept reassuring myself it was probably just a glitch, maybe the feed lagging, showing a shadow from moments ago. I continued to watch intently. That's when the shape turned. The shape wasn't fully turned, just pivoted enough that it was clearly not part of the window. It had C paraded from the glass, creating a gap between it and the curtain. Even though the details were murky, I could make out what seemed to be a face, lighter in the center, with darker patches on the sides, perhaps eyes or just shadows. It was staring right at the crib, motionless. I can't recall exactly standing up, but next thing I knew, I was rushing down the hallway, taking the stairs, 2 at a time. Without a second thought, without grabbing anything, I needed to get to her room. The door was shut just as we'd left it. I burst in quickly. The room felt cooler than it should have been, but not freezing. The window was closed, and the curtains were still drawn. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the crib was empty. I scanned the room frantically, looking under the crib, behind the rocking chair. Then I spotted her on the carpet beside the dresser, lying on her back, arms outstretched, gazing straight up at the ceiling, calm, not fussing or crying, as if she had been gently placed there. Relieved, I picked her up and felt her warmth and steady breathing. She even managed a small smile as I held her. Carrying her, I went into our bedroom, turned on the light, which woke my wife. She looked at me, puzzled and half asleep. I explained I found the baby on the floor and suggested maybe a crib rail was loose, but left it at that. The baby monitor was still downstairs. I didn't fetch it until the next morning. When I checked the monitor's feed, it had frozen at 11:13. The battery was fine, still on, but the screen was stuck on a frame showing that vague shape by the window, turned towards the crib, with the curtain also visible in the shot. I examined the crib, but found nothing broken or loose, no sign she could have climbed out or fallen. She was too small for that. I decided to move the camera to a shelf across the room for a better view. I didn't elaborate much to my wife, just mentioned wanting a different angle. That night, and for several nights following, the monitor displayed only the usual grainy, black and white image with no odd shapes or movements. But I started leaving the door open and kept the monitor volume up. She's older now. We've changed her room around, different curtains, a different monitor, a different crib. I haven't seen that shape again. I was out flying my drone at the old Miller farm on a clear Saturday afternoon. The farm, just outside town, had been deserted for years. The barn was half collapsed, and weeds had overtaken the rusted fence posts. It's the perfect spot for flying because it's mostly open fields with very few trees, allowing for broad, unobstructed shots. I was there to test some new camera settings for a freelance project. Nothing too complex. I usually choose these quiet, secluded spots to avoid bothering anyone with my drone. The weather was ideal, blue skies dotted with a few fluffy clouds, so I set up along the dirt road bordering the property and launched my drone from my backpack. I got it up to about 200 feet, just cruising over the fields, conducting slow sweeps with the camera. Everything felt smooth and under control, and I relished the moment of solitude away from the busyness of everyday life. About 10 minutes in, the drone began to respond sluggishly when I tried to turn it left, as if there was a delay in the response. Initially, I thought it might be interference from power lines, but a quick scan of my surroundings confirmed there were only open fields and an old farmhouse down the road. Then, something odd happened. The sunlight dimmed for a brief moment, not like a cloud passing over the sun, but more sudden, as if something dark had briefly crossed in front of it. Curious, I stopped the drone and tilted the camera upwards to see what had caused the shadow. The screen displayed a strange sight, a smooth, rounded, dark shape that was gliding silently across the sky. It was smaller than a plane, but definitely larger than a bird, possibly the size of a large drone, and it lacked any visible wings or protrusions. As it passed directly in front of the sun, it simply vanished without a trace. No shadow on the ground, no sound. At that very moment, my drone lost all connection to the controls. No matter how much I pushed the sticks or hit the emergency stop, there was no response. It continued to drift forward as if on autopilot, and then the video feed began to glitch. The screen flickered with black and white lines before freezing. When the feed came back, the camera was oddly pointed straight down at the grass below. I was already a bit on edge when my drone started acting up. There I was in the field, hitting the return to home button, but the drone wasn't having any of it. It just kept floating off towards the other side of the field, near the old barn. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't get it to respond. My heart was racing as I watched the controller's signal weaken, from full bars to just one, then completely gone. Even though the connection was mostly lost, the screen on my controller would flicker back to life now and then, showing static images or blurred scenes. At one point, the drone's camera briefly picked up something dark moving by the tree line. Before I could get a closer look, it disappeared. I was glued to the screen, hoping for more, but those moments felt like they lasted forever. Suddenly, everything went dead. The screen went black, the video feed stopped, and the controller beeped, signaling it had lost connection. Despite waiting for a bit, hoping it would come back online, nothing happened. Reluctantly, I decided not to wander around in the dark looking for it and left the farm. Driving away, I kept my eyes on the field through my rearview mirror, but there was nothing to see. The next morning, I returned at dawn with a friend to search for the drone. The ground gave no clues, it was dry, and there were no pieces of the drone or any tracks. Later, when I reviewed the downloaded footage, things took a strange turn. The video was clear until the moment the drone began to malfunction. It captured a dark shape gliding across the sun, just a smooth, edgeless shadow that briefly passed over the camera. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the image glitched. The camera angle skewed downwards, and the shadow vanished without a trace on the ground below. I replayed it multiple times, but found no signs of birds, planes, or anything usual. The video after the blackout was just corrupted static. I'm left with more questions than answers. It didn't seem like any drone or aircraft I know of. I don't dive into conspiracy theories, but I can't explain what happened. Since then, I haven't flown the drone. I'm not sure I want to, especially not alone out there. Earlier, I had stopped at a rest area just before midnight to catch some sleep after driving all day. The area was pretty bare bones, a few trucks parked on concrete slabs, a dimly lit restroom, and a couple of vending machines. Nothing out of the ordinary, but somehow fitting after the unsettling experience with my drone. I parked my rig in a quiet corner far from the others and settled in, turning off the engine and checking the time on my phone. It was 3:17 a.m. I set my alarm for 4 hours later, laid back, and quickly fell asleep. When I woke up, something felt incredibly off. Not just a weird sleep feeling, but as if the entire world had shifted slightly. The light filtering through the window was odd. Instead of the dark sky you'd expect at 3 a.m., it was a dull, muted greenish gray. Rubbing my eyes, I wondered if I was still dreaming or caught in some bizarre sleep paralysis, but everything remained eerily still, and that strange color persisted. The air felt heavy. As I tried to shake off the grogginess, I said something even more unsettling. All of my clocks, the one on my phone, the dashboard, and my CB radio, were frozen at 3:17. It made no sense. I felt sure I had been asleep for hours. I checked my phone again, but it was dead, refusing to turn on despite having a full battery when I went to sleep. Feeling a creeping unease, I then heard a low, steady hum coming from under my trailer. It wasn't the familiar sound of idling trucks or distant highway traffic, but something smooth, continuous, and mechanical, yet unplaceable. It wasn't loud, but I couldn't ignore it. It felt like something was vibrating right beneath me. I climbed out, squinting in the dim light, and checked under the trailer. There was nothing. No equipment, no animals, nothing that could explain the noise. I walked back and tried to start the engine. The dashboard lights flickered as the key turned, but the engine wouldn't catch, no matter how many times I tried. Looking up, I noticed the sky hadn't changed at all. It was still that odd color, static like a broken picture. Deciding I needed a change of scenery, maybe even find someone else awake, I headed towards the bathroom building. As I walked, the humming sound grew quieter, almost fading away. When I reached the building, I paused, taking in the continuing oddness surrounding me. I was at a rest area when everything felt off. The place was eerily quiet, no lights or sounds, not even from the usually buzzing vending machines. When I tried the door, I found it unlocked, but surprisingly heavy. Inside, the air was stale and cold, the overhead fluorescent lights dead. I went to the restroom, and looking in the mirror, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. My reflection was normal, but the room felt hollow, as if the light was merely pretending to be there. Peering out the window, the sky was a dull greenish gray. Suddenly, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye. I spun around, but there was nothing there, no one else around. Stepping back outside, I checked my truck's dash clock, which was still stuck at 3:17. I tried my phone again, but it was dead, no signal, no sound. I sat on a concrete slab outside the restroom, trying to make sense of things. Suddenly, a humming noise started, louder than before. It wasn't coming from beneath my trailer this time, but seemed to be coming from the field next to the rest area. I stood up and shone my flashlight toward the tall grass. I caught a glimpse of something smooth and dark moving, but it quickly vanished behind a tree. I called out, but my voice seemed distant, swallowed by the quiet night. The humming stopped once more. Unsure whether to return to my truck or seek help, I hesitated. Deciding to head back, the humming began again as I approached the truck, steady and low, vibrating through the ground. I tried to start the truck, but it was futile. Then I noticed the little green light on the dashboard, which indicates the ABS status and should be off when parked, was blinking in sync with the humming. I turned off the ignition completely, and both the light and the humming ceased. The sky began to darken, returning to normal night colors. I blinked, and everything seemed normal again. My phone's clock now read 3:19, and the dash clock resumed its movement. I didn't linger. The engine started immediately, and I drove away without looking back. Later, I shared the story with some fellow truckers, but none had heard of anything similar happening there. I still can't explain the humming or the strange events of that night. It was a typical late summer evening when we decided to go for our first night hike. There were 4 of us, friends seeking adventure in the hills outside town. We planned to start at dusk, trek to a clearing to see the city lights, and return before it got too late. Everything began so normally as we set out around 8 p.m., the sky still tinged with the last pinks of sunset. At first, the hike felt just like any other, with the crunch of leaves under our boots and the distant chirping of crickets. We had our flashlights and headlamps, plenty of batteries, and kept our pace leisurely, chatting and laughing. trying to push away the unease that nightfall brings. About an hour in, the trail took us deeper into the woods, where the trees stood dense and the canopy above stole most of the light. As the path narrowed and we continued, the ambient noises grew, a chorus of frogs rustling leaves and the occasional stirring of branches. Then, as we rounded a bend and the trail straightened, a strange clicking sound filled the air. It wasn't random like twigs breaking underfoot. This was rhythmic, deliberate, like a metronome or a slow mechanical ticking. It surrounded us, some sounds near, some far, echoing off the trees. We stopped dead in our tracks. The clicking continued, unwavering, as if driven by an unseen metronome. For a moment, none of us spoke. I turned off my flashlight, half wondering if the light was somehow triggering the sounds. The moment the beam went out, the clicking stopped. We exchanged puzzled looks. Then one friend quickly turned their light back on, and the clicking resumed at once. Curious, we experimented by turning our lights off and on, pointing them at different spots: the trees, the bushes, the empty trail ahead. Each time the light hit a spot, the clicking ceased instantly, only to resume in the darkness. We moved forward, our flashlights sweeping around, cautious, seeking the source of the noise. But there was nothing, no movement but the shadows of leaves and branches, no animals scurrying away, just silence in the light and persistent clicking in the dark. Mark whispered, wondering if it was some kind of machine or perhaps something else we couldn't see. All I knew was that this night was unlike any other. Why the clock had stopped at 3:17, why the sky had turned that odd shade, or what lurked behind the trees remained mysteries. That night had a surreal quality, and sometimes I still wonder if I ever truly woke up from it. We were out in the woods that night, just walking and exploring. The woods were quiet, heavier than usual, except for this strange clicking noise. It wasn't a normal sound you'd hear, like cicadas or beetles. It was different, rhythmic, and it stopped whenever we shone our flashlights towards it. It felt as though it was aware of us, deliberately hiding from the light. This went on for about 10 minutes, and the atmosphere started to make us nervous. We continued our hike, the flashlights scanning every direction, but each time the light hit the source of the clicks, they would abruptly stop. Then, suddenly, the clicking ceased altogether. There was nothing but the wind and our own breathing. We waited, stood still, hoping to hear it again, but it was over. The rest of the walk was eerily silent, making us feel even more on edge. When we reached the clearing, seeing the city lights made everything feel normal again. The usual sounds of the night returned, and there was no more clicking. We talked about it on the way down, speculating about what it could have been: a strange animal, or something else entirely. None of us had any real answers. Since that night, I've thought about it a lot. I've asked around, checked with local wildlife experts, but no one knows of any creature that makes a sound like that and stops when exposed to light. It's perplexing how the clicking seemed to deliberately stop, as if choosing not to be found. It wasn't just the silence of the woods that stuck with me, but how the clicking seemed to consciously avoid the light, aware it didn't want to be discovered. We'd been outside for about half an hour that quiet evening, just enjoying the sounds of crickets and the rare whoosh of a distant car. My brother was all about catching fireflies, his hands darting through the dimming light, trying to trap the glowing bugs. Meanwhile, I was messing around with a laser pointer, shooting its red beam into the sky, not really aiming at anything in particular. Eventually, my random pointing directed the laser towards a large, uneven cluster of clouds hanging unusually low over our neighborhood. As I hit that thick patch, I noticed something odd. A tiny flash of light blinked back at me. It seemed close, just past the tree line behind our house. This blinking light caught my attention because it flickered slowly, as if responding to my laser. I froze, laser still pointing in the direction of the flash, and watched as it began to move. It glided smoothly just above the treetops, heading straight over our house. I tried to get my brother to come and see, but he was too absorbed with his fireflies. Keeping my focus on the light, I watched as it silently drifted across the sky. The clouds, faintly illuminated by nearby streetlights, served as a backdrop for the little blinking light that now hovered directly overhead. It felt so close, almost within reach if I were taller. The light didn't flicker wildly or change colors, It just blinked calmly twice more, as if acknowledging my gaze. Then, slowly, it began to fade, sinking behind the clouds. I tried to keep the laser trained on it, but the beam scattered when it hit the cloud cover. The blinking ceased, and within a few minutes, the clouds shifted and the light completely disappeared. I looked around, half expecting to see someone else who might have noticed, but the street remained empty. No cars, no people, just the occasional hoot from an owl. I felt a stir of excitement mixed with a bit of nervousness, but kept it to myself. Calling my brother over again, I tried to explain what I had seen, but he simply shrugged it off and returned to his bugs. Later, back inside, I recounted the story to my parents, but they brushed it off, suggesting I either imagined it or saw a plane. The next morning brought another surprise. In our backyard, I found small, basketball-sized circles where the grass was flattened, as if something had rested there. My brother hadn't noticed them. It left me wondering about the mysterious light and whether it had been closer than I thought. I've been setting up trail cameras in remote spots for years, hoping to capture images of wildlife like deer or maybe a fox. This time, I chose a location deeper in the woods than usual, near a bend in the creek where the trees crowd thickly and the paths see little to no use. It seemed like a prime spot to catch something out of the ordinary. The camera was positioned on an old pine tree, about 5 feet off the ground, and angled slightly downward to get a good view of the trail and nearby brush. It was around 3:30 p.m., with the sun beginning to lower, but still casting plenty of light. After ensuring the batteries and memory card were secure, I left, the bumpy 20-minute drive home, giving me time to think. Although nothing specific was off, I couldn't shake a vague unease about the spot, dismissing it as the typical nerves of being alone in the woods. 2 days later, equipped with a fresh battery and a new memory card, I returned to find the camera exactly as I'd left it, untouched by animals or humans. That night, as I reviewed the footage on my laptop, it was mostly as expected: empty woods, a few squirrels, some deer. However, one clip from about an hour before dusk on the first day stopped me cold. It was just a 2-second shot, showing what at first glance seemed to be a mere silhouette. The figure was tall, unnaturally straight, and backlit by the setting sun, making it stand out sharply against the fading light. On a different note, there was one night that just didn't sit right with me. It wasn't particularly scary, just puzzling. I remember trying to make sense of it all as I stood outside, shining a laser pointer into the sky, just as I had done before when I saw something strange. That night, the sky responded with blinking lights that moved in an odd way, not typical of any aircraft or natural phenomenon I knew. It was as if something out there was watching, perhaps trying to communicate, but not with words or sounds, only those quiet, simple blinks. Twice it blinked, then it just disappeared behind the clouds. The circles I found the next morning in the grass might have been related, but I never mentioned them to anyone, not even my parents. I kept scanning the sky on subsequent nights, but nothing unusual happened again. Still, the memory of that night lingers, a silent acknowledgement from the unknown. In the footage, there was just a dark figure, almost like a shadow, that appeared for 2 seconds before the camera cut to static, showing nothing but the snow on the screen, like a broken TV signal. Suddenly, the camera stopped recording and didn't capture anything more. No motion triggers, no pictures, nothing. At first, I thought the battery might have died or the card got corrupted. However, checking the next day revealed the battery was fine and the card seemed okay too. I swapped out the card and left the camera running, but it never recorded anything after that. Replaying that clip repeatedly, the figure stood completely still, never moving or shifting, as if it was watching or waiting for something. The weird part was how the light hit it. The edges of the shape looked fuzzy, as if the figure was partially transparent or blurred. It wasn't fog or glare, it was something else. I showed the clip to a couple of friends who are into this kind of stuff. They thought it looked like a person at first, but the size and stillness were off. I agreed, it was too tall and unnatural for someone to stand so still in the woods. That night, I stayed up trying to figure out if the spot had any history of strange sightings or old stories, but nothing unusual came up. The forest is old, sure, but it seemed just normal, with the usual sounds of wildlife like birds, squirrels, and the wind through the leaves. Yet I felt a sense that the woods were aware of my presence. It wasn't threatening or scary, just a feeling of being watched. I found myself checking over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see something out of place, but there was never anything. A few days later, while walking back from the creek near that spot, something odd caught my eye with the shadows. The sun was low, casting long shapes across the forest floor. One shadow stood out. It was tall and straight, much like the figure from the footage, but there was no nearby tree or object that could cast it. The shadow stretched away into the brush, barely darker than the rest. I stopped and looked around, trying to find what was making it, but there was nothing. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. I figured it was just a trick of the light, but it stuck with me. That same night, I slept. I was camping at the forest's edge when I woke up at 3 a.m. to an eerie silence outside my camper. There were no crickets chirping, no leaves rustling, not even the whisper of the wind, just an unsettling quiet. Then, out of nowhere, a soft humming noise emerged. It was a low, pulsating sound that lasted around 10 seconds before fading away. I brushed it off, thinking it was either my imagination or perhaps some distant machine from another campsite, but the silence that followed felt strangely heavy, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The next morning, I glanced at my phone and noticed it was exactly 3:17 a.m. That specific time seemed to stick in my mind, though I couldn't figure out why. Over the following week, I kept checking the time, expecting some effing odd to happen again, but everything returned to normal. The usual forest sounds, the light, the shadows. Yet, my camera told a different story. After capturing a static frame that night, it never recorded again. I tested it a few weeks later in a different location near the forest edge, and it worked perfectly, capturing images of squirrels, raccoons, and deer with no anomalies. No strange figures, no static frames, no missing footage. Despite this, the image of a tall, motionless shape in that 2-second clip haunted me. I couldn't help but wonder who or what it was, why it didn't move, and why my camera stopped working immediately after capturing it. It's probably nothing, just a glitch. But now, whenever I'm in those silent woods, I can't shake the feeling that it might be out there, watching. I've been dabbling in night photography for a few years, mostly experimenting with long exposures to capture the stars and the Milky Way. There's something soothing about being outside in the still, dark world, just me and the sky. A couple of months ago, I drove to a place with minimal light pollution, ideal for my photography. I arrived around 11 p.m., set up my tripod and camera, and began taking shots of the night sky. Initially, everything seemed normal, just the usual black sky dotted with stars. However, when I reviewed the photos on my camera, I noticed an odd point of light that appeared in every single frame, always near the edge of the photo. At first, I thought it was a bright star or possibly a planet, but after checking an app, it didn't match any celestial body. I was checking my phone to see the night sky lineup. Venus was missing, Mars was on the other side, and neither satellites nor planes showed up on my tracker. Spotting an unidentifiable light, I initially thought my camera's sensor was glitching. After swapping lenses and taking multiple shots, the light stubbornly stayed in the same position relative to the frame, no matter the camera's direction. Curious, I repositioned my tripod all over, even walking a mile east to take more photos. Yet, the light persisted, unchanged in brightness and size, fixed to the camera frame while the sky shifted around it. This baffled me. It didn't behave like anything supposed to be in the sky or attached to the camera. Driving 20 miles further into darker, more secluded areas, I took yet more photos, but the result was the same. The light was always in the same spot in every shot, making me uneasy. Trying to view it through binoculars didn't help. It was just a small, constant light, neither blinking nor shifting. Feeling more unsettled, I sat on my car's hood, staring at the sky, waiting for any movement or blink, but nothing changed. Then about an hour in, a faint humming sound emerged. It was like a distant drone that you feel more than hear. With no cars, planes, or even wind rustling the trees, I walked towards the tree line, trying to trace the source of the sound. Yet the humming remained constant, seeming to envelop me. Suddenly, I realized the light was gone. It wasn't in the sky where it should have been. Frantically, I scanned around and checked my camera to capture it once more. Despite snapping a few photos, the light was absent, and the sky returned to its normal state with scattered stars. As I walked back to my car, the hum stopped, the air grew heavier, and a sense of being watched crept over me. I kept looking back, but only trees were behind me. No one else was there. I was out camping alone on a clear summer night, a few miles off the main road where the trees thin out, giving a wide view of the sky. There were no lights around, just the quiet and me. After setting up my tent and starting a fire, I settled in for the night. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I just wanted a night away from it all. After dinner, I sat on a log, beer in hand, and gazed with head up at the stars. It was one of those nights where the sky feels vast and endless, with only the fire's crackle and distant insect sounds breaking the silence. I've always enjoyed stargazing while camping. There's something timeless about the steady presence of the stars. Then, unexpectedly, I noticed something odd about one star toward the south, low on the horizon. It seemed brighter than the others. Initially, I thought it might be a planet like Venus, but it didn't just stay bright. It got brighter slowly, as if it was glowing more intensely than the other stars. Later, when I returned to my car, the atmosphere changed. It was cold and dark, so I turned on the heater to warm up. I tried to turn on the car radio for some background noise, but it was eerily silent. No static, no stations, just a blank screen. Usually, I could pick up at least a faint signal or some static, but this time there was nothing. I tried turning the radio off and on a few times, but nothing changed. Driving back the way I came, I felt tense, my eyes darting between the road and the sky. As I passed the spot where I first saw the unusual light, I looked up. The sky was clear, with stars twinkling, but the strange light was nowhere to be seen. A couple of miles down the road, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number appeared. "You saw it." I froze for a second, my hands gripping the wheel tighter. The message had no name, no reply option. I deleted it, thinking it was a prank, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, I checked my photos from the previous night. The images taken after the light disappeared looked perfectly normal. No weird artifacts, no odd light spots, just stars. I've gone back to that spot a few times since then, sometimes at night, sometimes during the day, hoping to find something, anything, that explains what I saw. But there's been nothing. The light never showed up again, either in any photo or in the sky. I haven't told many people about it because I don't have answers, and it sounds weird. But every time I look at my old photos, that strange light is there, locked in the same corner of every frame, as if it's watching me, or maybe waiting for me to notice it again. I was driving through the mountains late one night, heading home after visiting a friend a couple of hours away. The road was mostly empty, with just the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. It's one of those narrow, winding two-lane roads that snake around the hills, where you really need to watch every curve because the guardrails are either thin or completely missing. About halfway along the ridge, with my windows cracked open to keep the air circulating, I noticed a car up ahead, a small sedan. That night, one star caught my attention because it kept getting brighter, like the moon, but without the moon's shape or texture. I watched it for about 10 minutes, squinting and wondering if my eyes were deceiving me, as it grew brighter and then began to dim just as slowly. Strangely, as it faded, it started to shift slightly to the east. It didn't behave like a plane or satellite. Those usually blink or move more quickly. This thing was moving steadily and smoothly, like it was just drifting. It didn't make sense, because stars don't just change position in minutes. As it dimmed and drifted, the calm of the night seemed to be underlined with a layer of tension. I kept looking over my shoulder back into the woods, but there was nothing. No sounds out of the ordinary, no sign of anyone else nearby. Eventually, the fire began to die down, so I got up to poke at it, trying to distract myself from fixating on the light. When I glanced back, the star was almost back to normal brightness, but it had moved from where it was, as if it had slipped behind a thin layer of clouds or just out of sight. I stood there for a while longer, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. The sky returned to its normal state, with the stars steady and quiet as they always are. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off or that something was watching me, but being alone only intensified these feelings. I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that bright star growing, then fading and drifting just out of reach. By morning, everything seemed normal. The woods were quiet and the campfire ashes were cold. I packed up and left, but that night stayed with me in a way I can't explain. I don't know what I saw or why it moved the way it did. All I know is that it wasn't just a star. The brake lights flashed a couple of times, as if the driver was tapping them, maybe gearing up to slow down. Slowly, the car began drifting toward the right edge of the lane, gently easing onto the shoulder. At first, I didn't give it much thought, but then the car subtly lifted off the ground. It wasn't abrupt or theatrical, but a gentle, almost floating ascent, rising about 2 or 3 feet above the pavement. The tires were no longer in contact with the road. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was seeing things because I was tired or the headlights were playing tricks on me. But no, the car remained there, suspended and silent. It hovered quietly for about 5 seconds, without any change in engine noise, no wobbling or sudden movements. It was just steady there in midair. Then, as quietly as it had risen, it descended back onto the road. The tires met the asphalt with a soft thud, and the car continued on, rolling forward as if nothing had happened. The brake lights flickered on once more, and then off, and the car kept moving at the same slow pace. I kept my eyes fixed on it, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The entire episode felt unreal, but everything else, the road, the trees, the night sky, appeared normal. I glanced in my rearview mirror a few times to check if there were any other cars behind me, but the road was empty. I thought about pulling over and making a call, but my phone was charging in the center console, and I didn't want to take my eyes off the car, just in case it did something else strange. After a few more minutes, the car turned off onto a side road and disappeared from view. I stayed on the main road, driving on while feeling a bit numb and uncertain about whether to tell anyone what I had seen. A few miles later, I stopped at a small roadside diner that was still open. The place was deserted, except for a waitress, who seemed to have been there for ages, likely in her 50s. I asked her if she had seen anything unusual on the road that night. She hesitated, then shared that people often report seeing weird stuff around here late at night. Unusual lights, inexplicable sounds, but she didn't pay much attention to it. I nodded, but chose not to mention the hovering car. It felt too bizarre to even say out loud. When I finally got home, I checked my phone for any local news reports or social media buzz about strange occurrences. There was nothing. In the days that followed, I found myself looking up at the sky more often during my drives, but I never saw anything like that again. Still, the memory of that car hovering lingered in my mind, especially when I was alone on the road. I couldn't figure out what it was or why it had happened. Late one October afternoon, after work, I went hunting in the woods. I know these woods well, having walked the same ridge for years. The sky was clear, and the air had that crisp calmness typical of an autumn evening. As the sun dipped lower, the forest began to settle into a deep, tranquil silence, the kind that heralds the approach of night. As usual, the day had been uneventful, marked only by the occasional sound of squirrels or birds. I was making my way to a familiar clearing near a small creek, a spot I often checked, but I wasn't really expecting to encounter much. Then, unexpectedly, about 20 yards ahead at the edge of the clearing, I saw a deer. What struck me was not just the deer's presence, it was its eerie stillness. It stood frozen, staring skyward with wide-open eyes that didn't blink. Typically, a deer would either bolt or at least adjust its stance if it sensed a human nearby, but this one didn't move at all. It looked as though it had been standing there for hours, its neck tilted at an odd angle, giving it a look of shock or awe. Curious and a bit concerned, I lowered my rifle and approached slowly, half expecting to find the deer injured or ill. However, as I got closer, I saw no signs of injury, no limp, no blood, and it seemed to be breathing normally. Its fur was clean and smooth, and its gaze remained fixed on something above, although I could see nothing out of the ordinary in the clear blue sky framed by a few treetops and the normal afternoon sun. I took a step forward, and still the deer didn't move. It seemed to be caught in some kind of trance, or perhaps it had a neurological issue, but its posture seemed almost deliberate. I kept my distance and circled around to get a better view, but the deer stayed rooted to the spot, its eyes locked on the sky. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by distant bird calls and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The wind was still, and as I scanned the clearing and the tall, silent trees casting long shadows, nothing seemed amiss. Yet the air felt heavier, reminiscent of the oppressive calm before a storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but there was no clue in the surroundings as to what it might be. I was sitting in my backyard one night, just like many other nights, gazing up at the sky. I'm no professional, just a guy with a cheap telescope I picked up in an online sale and a pair of half-broken binoculars. The sky was clear that day, a perfect setup for stargazing. Yet something felt off as I noticed the shadows from the trees around the clearing. It was late afternoon, and normally the shadows would stretch toward the east. But oddly, all the shadows leaned slightly north, as if the sun had just shifted sideways. I thought maybe I was seeing things because I was tired, or maybe the uneven ground was playing tricks on my eyes. Despite the weird shadows, the deer in the clearing didn't move. It seemed frozen, eyes locked on the sky. I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. I scanned the dense woods that edged the clearing, looking for any sign of animals or movement, but there was nothing, just eerie stillness. The deer kept staring upwards, and I couldn't help but stay a bit longer, hoping to see what it was looking at. I tried to clear my head and even took a few steps back, thinking about leaving, yet I stayed, drawn by curiosity. After about 10 minutes, the deer blinked slowly, turned its head sharply, and bolted into the forest without making a sound. My heart raced as I stood there, staring at the spot where it had vanished. Slowly, the shadows around me shifted back to their normal angles. The air felt lighter, and the sounds of the evening began to return. The rustling of leaves, distant bird calls, and insects starting their nightly chorus. I walked back to my truck, not looking back. On the drive home, I kept replaying the scene in my mind. The frozen deer, the odd shift in shadows, that sudden eerie feeling. When I got home, I checked the weather and light conditions from that afternoon. Everything was normal. Clear skies, the sun setting where it should, no unusual reports from the area. It sounded crazy, and I didn't tell anyone about it. Sometimes when I'm sitting on my porch at night, I think about that deer and how it just stopped, staring at something unseen, as if it knew something. I didn't. I've been back to that clearing a few times since then. Everything was normal, just regular deer, regular shadows. But now and then, when I'm out there alone, I find myself looking up at the sky a bit longer than usual, wondering if whatever caught that deer's attention might still be lurking up there. I've always found it soothing to watch the night sky, tracking satellites and the occasional high-flying plane. It's a comforting routine. On this particularly clear, albeit slightly chilly, early fall evening, I was settled near the fence, my telescope aimed southwest, a prime spot for satellite spotting. As usual, I was checking my phone where I keep notes on satellite schedules when something caught my eye. A small white dot moved across the sky. At first glance, it seemed like just another satellite, moving slowly and steadily. But after watching it for a few minutes, I noticed it wasn't following the typical straight path of satellites. This one actually stopped, completely stopped. I rubbed my eyes, double-checked the focus on my telescope, and there it was, just hanging motionless in the sky. Then it did something even more bizarre. It changed direction slightly, curving slowly at first, then suddenly accelerating at a breakneck speed, far faster than any satellite or plane I'd ever seen. I scrambled to track it with my telescope, but it was no use. My equipment wasn't cut out for this. It vanished from sight in an instant. Stunned, I sat back, staring at the empty spot in the sky where it had disappeared. That's when I noticed the stars didn't seem as bright as usual. It was odd. The sky was clear, but the stars looked dimmer. Checking my phone for the time, I was shocked to see it was almost an hour later than I thought. It felt like only 20 minutes had passed. I double-checked, but the time was correct. Feeling a bit unsettled, I began to pack up. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint red glow near the edge of my yard. It wasn't any kind of light I recognized, more like a soft, pulsating red orb hovering just off the ground. At first, I thought it might be a firefly or a reflection, but there was nothing nearby that could explain it. Late one night, I saw a red light near my yard. Unlike any insect or typical aerial object, it hovered, pulsing steadily. Curious, I called out, wondering if someone was there, but got no response. Moments later, the light disappeared, as if it had never existed. I spent the rest of the night restless, troubled by what I had seen. The following morning, I scoured the news and online forums for any reports of unusual lights or stray satellites, but found nothing. Determined to understand, I returned a few nights later, this time accompanied by a friend deeply versed in astronomy. Though skeptical, he agreed to help me investigate. We set up telescopes and cameras, but only captured typical night sky activity, satellites and airplanes. However, reviewing photos from the first night, I noticed odd lines and shadows in the images taken right after the sighting, which weren't artifacts from the telescope or camera. Still puzzled by the experience, I've considered satellite glitches or peculiar reflections as explanations, but the abrupt stop and rapid disappearance of the light don't fit those theories. Sometimes, while outside late at night, I find myself scanning the sky, half expecting to see the mysterious red light again. It moved too quickly and precisely to be a plane or drone, and its eerie presence made it feel like something was watching or signaling me, though I can't fathom why. I keep watching the skies, just in case. Last September, I went camping alone to clear my head. The weather was mild, and the national forest offered the solitude I sought. About 4 miles in, I found a quiet spot near a stream off the main trail where I had camped once before. It wasn't an official campsite, just a peaceful, flat area surrounded by trees, away from cell service. I arrived about an hour before sunset after passing only a couple on their way out. Setting up camp was straightforward. I pitched my tent, collected twigs and logs for a fire, and prepared for a night under the stars. Nothing fancy, just me, the wilderness, and my thoughts. By the time I got the fire going, it was already dark, and I had settled in with a cold sandwich and some water. I didn't bother to turn on my headlamp much. Instead, I just sat there, enjoying the fire. After eating, I set up my sleeping bag inside the tent and pulled out a few essentials: my jacket, headlamp, a paperback, and my knife, which I always keep close when camping alone. I remember I casually left my bag leaning against a log near the fire, not even zipped up. My cook set and tarp were still strewn about on the other side, just where I tossed them. I'm not very meticulous when I'm camping by myself. Nearby, my boots were off by the tent flap, and I had draped a pair of socks over a branch to dry. It was just a typical, slightly messy campsite. I didn't stay awake for too long. After the fire died down, I crawled into my tent. It was around 10, maybe a bit later. I checked my watch before I tucked in. I read for a little while using my headlamp, then switched it off and settled back. The forest wasn't silent, just filled with the soft rustling of trees and the buzz of night insects. Nothing unusual caught my attention, and I quickly fell asleep. I woke up and it was still dark, the exact time unclear. There were no distinct sounds, no dreams, just a sudden wakefulness and an odd feeling of being unsettled, like forgetting what day it was. The fire was completely out, and the night was unusually still, almost as if the air was thick, like wearing earplugs. I noticed the tent flap seemed brighter outside than it should have been for that hour, not like moonlight, but a pale gray glow that you'd see just before dawn. Yet, it was too early for that. Curious and a bit uneasy, I sat up in my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent flap. The sky was overcast, no stars, and the strange gray light seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond the trees, sourceless, like a giant lantern had been lit behind the forest. I just sat there for a few minutes, staring out, too perplexed to even think about grabbing my knife or investigating further. Nothing happened. The light stayed consistent, neither moving nor changing in intensity. Eventually, I lay back down, still fully clothed, with the tent only half zipped, rationalizing it might be something mundane like headlights from a Forest Service truck, reflecting oddly due to the overcast conditions. When I woke up, the tent was filled with real sunlight, not like the low clouds from earlier. It must have been around 7 a.m. At first, I thought I had dreamed everything from the night before, but as I stepped outside, it was clear that wasn't the case. My boots were neatly placed, side by side, just outside the tent, with socks folded on top. My pack was upright by the fire pit, fully zipped, containing the tarp and cook set. My knife was in its usual hiking spot in the side pouch, and my jacket was rolled and strapped underneath. Everything was exactly where I would have put it myself, except I hadn't packed any of it. The fire pit was cold, with the ash neatly piled up. There were no twigs or wrappers from my sandwich, and the log I had leaned my bag against was now bare. It looked as though no one had stayed there at all. I walked around the campsite perimeter, but found no tracks, prints, or any sign of disturbance. The ground was only damp from dew, showing no mud or disturbed earth. Whoever or whatever had been there left no trace. I checked my pack again. There were no signs of tampering, nothing missing or added, and no damage. Even my food was still sealed, and the water bottle had the same amount of water as before. It was as if someone had just tidied up everything exactly how I would have. Upon closer inspection, I noticed the tent stakes had been pulled out and laid in a bundle next to the tent, with the corners of the tent neatly folded inward. I stood there in silence, surrounded by the sounds of birds and the wind. The forest seemed unchanged, familiar even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened while I had blinked. I finished packing up the tent and left without stopping for water. The entire hike back was solitary, marked only by the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of the trail beneath my feet. I didn't encounter a single person or hear any distant footsteps. Back at the car, everything seemed normal again. Yet I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once as I drove away. There were no other vehicles or signs of anyone following me. When I got home, I dumped my gear onto the floor. Everything was there. But when I picked up the book I'd been reading the night before, I noticed the bookmark had moved. It was a typical night shift for me, driving patrol for the county sheriff's office. The roads were bordered tightly by trees, under a sky densely speckled with stars. I was cruising along the back roads just past midnight when the dispatch alerted me to a situation. A car was seen parked on an old logging road off Highway 47, about 10 miles out from the closest town. The call suggested it might be someone stranded or just goofing around. Headlights on, engine running, but no one in sight. I made my way over, driving off the main road onto a dirt track, stirring up clouds of dust. When I arrived, the scene was bathed in darkness, except for the bright lights of a silver sedan. It was parked awkwardly, half on and half off the road, engine still humming. I parked my cruiser a little way behind it, switched off my lights, and radioed in. Unit 42, I've located the car, but there's no sign of the driver, I reported. The air was cool, around mid-50s, and notably dry. No birds were chirping, which struck me as odd for that time of year. The only sounds were the distant hum of insects and the steady rhythm of the car's engine. I got out of my cruiser, flashlight in hand, and started inspecting the car. Inside was bare, except for the usual clutter: an old water bottle, gum packet squeezed between the seats, and some scattered receipts. The keys, still in the ignition. Then something caught my eye on the ground. About 20 feet in front of the car, there was a patch of grass flattened into perfect circles, each scorched around the edges as though burnt by something hot. Curious, I shone my light around. The tall pines cast long shadows over the scene, adding to the eerie feel. The road curved and vanished into the dense woods, but no footprints or tracks were anywhere to be seen, not near the car, nor near the mysterious circles. It was odd, given the dry yet soft ground, which should have easily held prints. I radioed dispatch again. Dispatch, this is Unit 42. Still no sign of the driver. There are burnt, circular marks in the grass near the vehicle. No tracks leading away. The line crackled with static before they acknowledged and mentioned backup was on its way. Wiping sweat from my forehead, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling about the abandoned car in front of me. There was no damage to the vehicle, nor any signs that the driver had been forced to leave due to an accident or a medical emergency. The radio had gone quiet, leaving only the faint hum of the car's engine in the background. As I stood by the passenger side, I used my flashlight to inspect the ground. The circles in the grass seemed burned into it from above, crispy, yet the soil beneath was undisturbed. No food, prints, nothing to indicate someone had been standing there with something hot. It was puzzling and unsettling. Suddenly, my attention shifted as I spotted a quick movement in the tree line just across the road. A shadow flickered between the trunks, too deliberate in its movement to be a deer or any small animal. Dropping my phone, I aimed my flashlight towards the shadow, but saw nothing more than the dark outline of trees. The sense of being watched overwhelmed me, and I instinctively took a step back towards my cruiser. Perhaps I should call for backup or wait inside the car with the engine running. However, before I could decide, I heard a low, vibrating sound, similar to a distant engine but distinctly non-mechanical. It seemed to emanate from beneath the ground, unsettling in its ambiguity. Then, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered out, plunging everything into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, its beam weak and barely cutting through the blackness. Looking back at the car, I noticed the circles in the grass now glowed faintly, edged with a cool bluish tint. Calling out into the darkness, "Hello, you out here?" met with no response, only the persistent hum that now seemed to vibrate through the soles of my boots. I tried to radio dispatch. Unit 42, car just shut off on its own, but got no response. The signal was too spotty, and my phone showed no service. Back at the cruiser, I double-checked my equipment while trying to make calls, but nothing went through. As I waited, the mysterious humming faded, and the faint glow from the circles dimmed, leaving me enveloped in silence and darkness, pondering the eerie quiet of the night. I was driving home from work one night around 11:30 p.m. The roads were quiet. Suddenly, the air around me felt thick, as if it had weight, and my fingers started tingling. My breathing became heavier than normal. I tried to stay calm, reasoning that cars break down and people leave them for all sorts of silly reasons. But then I noticed the absence of footprints, the burnt circles on the ground, and my patrol car suddenly shutting off. None of it made sense. As I sat there, I realized the cruiser's headlights were dimming, suggesting the batteries were draining unusually fast. I turned them off to save power, locked the doors, and kept an eye on the road and tree line, searching for any movement. It felt like hours had passed, but it was probably closer to 20 minutes when backup finally arrived. Their headlights cut through the darkness. Over the radio, they reached out. "Unit 43 here. We're on scene. What's the situation?" I briefed them on everything. The deputies inspected the circles in the grass, equally baffled. We called the fire department to check for chemical or electrical burns, but they found nothing. Despite a thorough search, we found no traces of the driver or any other disturbances, no footprints, tracks, or campsites, just that abandoned car and the strange scorched circles. We towed the car back to the station, and I stayed overnight to monitor it, watching the footage from my cruiser's dashcam. The recording had stopped just a few minutes after I arrived on the scene. The video flickered and then turned to static. Rewinding it, I noticed that right before it cut out, the camera captured a flash of bright white light coming from the direction of the circles. I never heard anything more about the driver or the car. The case was simply filed under abandoned vehicle. I asked around, but no one had reported a missing person matching a description. That incident left me with a nagging feeling, as if something unseen was there, watching me, something that didn't want to be found. I still drive that road sometimes, especially late at night, and I swear I catch glimpses of light flickering between the trees. Nothing concrete, just shadows upon ND flashes. The circles in the grass never reappeared, but I sometimes wonder if they're still there, hidden beneath the weeds. I don't know what it was that night. All I know is it wasn't just a car left running with no driver. There was something else out there, something unexplainable, and that's the part that stays with me. Driving home, there were only a few cars around. I usually have my phone on silent while driving, and that day was no different. After pulling into my driveway, I checked my phone and noticed a new voicemail. The number was unfamiliar, and oddly enough, it appeared to be from my own number. Things felt strange immediately. I played the message. It was my voice, sounding panicked and confused, discussing a light that immobilized me. I had no recollection of leaving this message. Even more bizarre, there was no record of this call in my recent calls list, neither incoming nor outgoing, just the voicemail. Sitting on my couch, I played it over and over. It was unmistakably my voice and tone, but I had no memory of it. The message conveyed sheer panic. I don't know what this is. It's just a light. It's right there, and I can't move. It won't let me move. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Then, abruptly, it cut off. I racked my brain trying to recall if I had been fiddling with my phone or if it could have been recorded accidentally, but nothing made sense. I don't talk in my sleep, and I never make unintentional calls or messages. Plus, there were no call records. The previous night, I had gone for a late walk around 10 p.m. to clear my head, something I seldom do and never with my phone. The streets were dimly lit, and the neighborhood was quiet. As I neared the park corner, I noticed a faint, unusual glow in the distance near the tree line. It was a pale, steady, bluish-white light, not flickering or moving, just hanging at about the height of a tree. It didn't resemble any street lamp, and there were no nearby cars or houses lit up. I thought it might be a flashlight or someone's phone, but no one was around. The park was deserted. Trying to ignore it, I continued walking, but the light seemed to persistently follow. It didn't move any closer, but whenever I stopped and looked, it was always in the same relative spot. A chilling sensation crept over me, as though I was being watched, yet there were no footsteps, no sounds, just that eerie light. I rushed home and locked the doors, trying to convince myself it was just someone with a drone or a prank, but it felt far from harmless. The last clear thing I remember was hearing that voicemail. I immediately went through my phone settings, checked the audio logs, permissions, and anything else that might explain the recording. Everything seemed normal. No apps were active that could have recorded me, and I had no reason to record myself like that. I even considered the possibility that someone had hacked my phone and left the message, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would anyone record a panicked message in my own voice when they could just call or text me the next day? After hearing the message, I couldn't stop thinking about the voicemail and the strange light I had seen. I found myself constantly looking out the window, half expecting to see that glow again. At work, I felt distracted, almost paranoid, as if people were watching me or something was lurking just out of sight. I kept checking my phone, hoping not to find more strange messages or calls, but there were none. I confided in a close friend, played the voicemail for him, and he was just as puzzled as I was. He suggested it might be a glitch or a virus, but I had never experienced anything like that before. I tried to put it behind me, but odd things kept happening. Lights in my house flickered, the TV would turn on by itself for a second, and late at night, I heard a faint humming noise outside my window. I checked every time, but never saw anything. One night, driven by a need for answers, I recorded myself talking about the whole experience. When I played it back, I noticed a faint background noise that I hadn't heard while recording, a low, steady hum, almost like a vibration. It reminded me of the weird light from the park, the one that had paralyzed me. I returned to the park to see if the light was still there, but found nothing. The spot was dark and quiet, with just the usual street lights and the rustling of trees. I still don't understand what happened that night or how that voicemail ended up on my phone. All I know is that I heard myself talking about feelings and sights that I don't remember. That light seems to have left a mark on me, one I can't explain. Since then, I've kept my phone close and avoid walking alone at night. The voicemail is still on my phone. Sometimes I play it to remind myself that what I experienced wasn't all in my head, though I'm not sure I always want to hear it. At 10 p.m., my stepdad had already crashed in the recliner, TV blaring as he snoozed. Confident they were out for the night, I quietly made my exit through the back door. Our house is notoriously squeaky, but once they're asleep, they're really out. I was headed to meet some school friends at our regular hangout, the old batting cages behind the gas station. It was only a 15-minute walk along the back trails, so I grabbed just my phone and a hoodie since the night was chilly but clear, with a sky full of stars and no breeze. Dressed in sneakers and jeans, nothing too heavy, I started my walk. The trail meandered behind the water treatment plant, followed the creek, and then skirted the fence by the ball fields. It was dark, unlit, but familiar. I've walked it many times. I kept my phone's flashlight on, lighting the path just in front of my feet. I reached the batting cages around midnight. Jamie, Lex, and Chris, a guy I didn't know too well, were already there. Someone had brought a speaker, and music played softly in the background. We hung out on the broken benches, sharing a vape and chatting about mundane things. No one was drinking or doing anything out of the ordinary, just enjoying each other's company. At 12:17, I checked my phone, chuckling to myself about the specific time. I wasn't in a hurry, but I planned to head home by 1 a.m., my usual unspoken curfew. If I sneaked back by 1:15, no one would notice. By 12:40, I was saying goodbye to everyone. Jamie told me, "Text when you get in," and I nodded, though I never did end up texting. The walk back was quiet and dark, just like it always is. I continued using my phone for light, keeping it low. The vibes were normal, no sense of being followed, just the usual silence of the night. But at some point, something odd happened. I didn't feel like I blacked out, and I don't think I stopped walking. It was more like I blinked and suddenly realized something was off. The trail seemed narrower, the trees taller and closer together than I remembered. I stopped and turned around slowly, using my flashlight to try and figure out where I might have gone wrong. My heart began to race a bit, but I reassured myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. I probably just veered off the path a bit, I thought. I had taken a wrong turn onto a side deer path, and that's when I noticed the eerie silence. There were no bugs buzzing, no leaves rustling, nothing. Even the nearby creek, which I should have been able to hear, was silent. It was like being in a soundproof room, outdoors. My breathing seemed unusually loud in the quiet. Checking the time, I glanced at my phone only to find its screen black and unresponsive. Despite having been barely used and having at least 60% battery earlier, it was completely dead. Pressing the power button did nothing, nor did tapping the screen. It was just dead. Holding my useless phone, I sensed a subtle shift in the air around me. It wasn't something I saw or heard, but I felt it. No wind, just a strange movement of air, like a pressure change you feel when driving through different elevations quickly. I turned off my flashlight and paused, trying to tune into my surroundings. That's when a soft, slow flash of light caught my eye. It was not bright or sudden, but more like an underpowered camera flash, just ahead through the trees, and then it was gone. It lit up nothing, simply appeared and disappeared. The air still felt strange as I resumed walking, unsure if I was even heading in the right direction. Time seemed distorted. I couldn't tell if I'd been walking for minutes or an hour. Soon, I noticed my legs aching and my feet squishing in my shoes. They were soaking wet. I crouched down, touching my jeans, only to find them damp up to my calves. My fingers came back cold. Yet, the trail itself was dry. It hadn't rained, there were no puddles, and I hadn't crossed the creek. Looking around, I started to feel really uneasy, not exactly dizzy, more like that disoriented feeling when you wake up too quickly. It felt like I had stumbled into a place I wasn't meant to be. Not in a dangerous way, but as if whatever was around didn't mind me being there, yet I didn't belong. Then I heard a noise. It was a low, distant rumbling with a rhythmic quality, but not mechanical. It sounded more like deep, steady breathing. I was flying my drone in the field behind the old quarry on a hot, cloudless Sunday afternoon in late August. It was around 6 p.m., and the spot was just right. Big open space, no people, no power lines or trees to interfere. It's technically private land, but it's been unused for years, with just a crumbling gate and some rusted-out machinery off to the side. I'd flown my drone there many times before. From the same direction where I'd seen the light earlier, I chose not to head towards it. I doubt I could have made myself go there even if I wanted to. Instead, I just walked steadily, keeping my pace even but not fast, and my eyes glued to the ground. I didn't dare look back. As I walked, the trees started to look more familiar, more spaced out. I recognized the log I had jumped over on my way in. A few minutes later, I spotted the water plants and the fence. When I reached the edge of the neighborhood, the streetlights seemed blindingly bright, almost as if I'd been underground. I cut through a couple of backyards and got home without running into anyone. I didn't even bother taking off my shoes. I just went straight to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. It was 2:41 a.m., according to the clock on my nightstand. That didn't seem right. I had left the cages around 12:40. Even dragging my feet, the walk back should have taken 20 minutes, max. I stared at the clock, disbelief washing over me. I plugged in my phone, which took an eternity to turn on, only to find it completely drained. No messages, no calls, nothing between 12:17 and 2:43 a.m. My shoes were still soaked, full-on puddles in the soles. I dumped the water into the trash can. The cuffs of my jeans were covered in dark grit, like fine gravel or sand. I sniffed the inside of one shoe, and it didn't smell like creek water, more like old metal or something. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't exactly fear that kept me awake. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. Not following, just watching, as if I had wandered through some space and it had paused just long enough to notice me. The next day, I walked the trail again during daylight. The creek was dry on both sides of the bridge, no mud, no water. The trail itself was fine, nothing unusual. I checked my route against a map. There were no forks or turns I could have missed, no side trails looping around. It was as if I had walked home in a straight line, but it took 2 hours to do it. I was out in a field, mostly covered in tall grass and gravel, flying my DJI drone. I'm not a professional. I'm just a guy with too much free time who enjoys capturing wide tracking shots and experimenting with low-altitude maneuvers. Typically, I fly the drone slowly and low, speeding up the footage later during editing. My techniques are pretty straightforward. On that day, after about an hour, I switched the drone to follow mode and jogged a loop around the field. The drone tracked me from behind, and everything seemed normal. Later, I decided to send the drone up about 300 feet and let it hover while I checked out some of the shots on the controller. I wasn't paying attention to the live feed as I scrolled through the shots, wiping sweat off my forehead from time to time. Looking up, I noticed the drone, just a tiny white dot against the blue sky, perfectly still. Then, suddenly, something flickered on the screen. It wasn't a glitch or a freeze, but a quick flash of movement. Curious, I tapped the screen to recenter the camera. That's when I saw something dart across the frame from right to left. It was small and clear, moving too straight and too fast to be a bird or an insect on the lens. It seemed to know exactly where it was going. I first thought it might be another drone, but I hadn't heard any noise from it. I quickly tried to spin the camera to follow the mysterious object. For a few seconds, I saw nothing. Then it reappeared, this time moving in the opposite direction. Strangely, it didn't turn around. It just reversed as if it had hit an invisible barrier and shot back the way it came, maintaining the same speed and trajectory. I tapped the screen to manually track it and managed to lock on for a couple of seconds. The feed zoomed in, and I got a better look at it. It was a dull gray object with no lights, rotors, or wings, shaped somewhat like a short cylinder or a thermos. Then abruptly, it stopped midair, freezing without any deceleration. I watched the feed intently, expecting it to drop or drift, but it just hovered silently for about 3 seconds. Then, it shot straight up, directly vertical, as if being pulled by an invisible line, and disappeared into the sky in a blink. I physically looked up, trying to spot it with my own eyes, but there was nothing, just the empty sky. Turning back to the controller, I rewound the footage and went through it frame by frame. I half expected to discover it was all my imagination or a glitch in the app, but the footage was clear. You could see it enter, pause, reverse, stop, and then shoot upwards, all captured cleanly on my drone's camera. The drone was flying smoothly at first, without any hitches, when suddenly it began to drift slightly, about a foot or two off course. It wasn't responding properly to my controls. When I tried to adjust, nothing happened initially. Then abruptly it jerked sideways. I attempted to lower it, but it hesitated, dropping only after a noticeable delay. Despite the controller indicating a strong connection, the response felt as if the signal was weak. As it hovered around 80 feet, the drone began to spin on its own without any command from me to do so. It wasn't spinning quickly, but it was constant. I tried to correct it, to no avail. I pressed the joystick to bring it down, but then it just stopped descending at about 60 feet. Suddenly, the video feed on the controller went black. though the battery level was fine, and it still showed a GPS lock. The camera feed was gone, but I could still hear the drone buzzing somewhere above me. I stood there for a moment, hoping the video would return, when I heard something unusual. It sounded like a footstep on gravel about 20 feet behind me. I spun around quickly to see who was there, but found nothing, just an empty, flat field. No movement in the grass, no wind at all. I looked up again. The drone was still in the air, no longer spinning, but it wasn't descending either. Trying another tactic, I switched the drone to sport mode, bring it down quicker, but still, nothing changed. The video feed didn't return. Then I heard it again, that same crunching sound from the same spot. I turned more slowly this time, scanning the area thoroughly, but still, I was alone. My car was parked on the opposite side of the quarry, a 5-minute walk away, and no other cars had been there when I arrived. Up until that moment, I hadn't heard any other sounds since I got there. Suddenly, all natural sounds seemed to stop. No wind, no birds, not even the insects. It was eerily silent, like the entire field had been muted. All I could hear was the blood pulsing in my ears. I looked up once more, and the drone finally began to descend, slowly at first, then at a normal speed. The video feed flickered back to life, fuzzy initially, then stabilizing to clear visibility. It landed exactly where it had taken off, sitting still without any further odd movements. I didn't rush to pack up. Instead, I just stood there, holding the controller, enveloped in the silence. After a few seconds, the quiet was broken by a gentle breeze and a distant crow. Just like that, everything seemed to return to normal. I turned off the drone, packed up, and left the field. As I drove back home from the field, I didn't turn on any music. My mind was busy replaying what I had just captured on my drone's camera. Once home, I immediately transferred the footage onto my laptop. It was exactly as I remembered. The object's movements were fast and smooth, executing sharp turns without any apparent change in angle. The most striking part was a vertical shot where the object went from a complete stop to disappearing in less than a second. It left no trail, no distortion, not even a shadow. It simply vanished into the thin air. I also checked the drone's telemetry data. There were no logged errors, even during the spin or when the signal was lost. The battery's voltage was normal, and the compass showed no unusual spikes. Everything seemed in order, yet I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I've returned to that same field a few times since then, but never witnessed anything similar. Now, every time I fly the drone, I'm half expecting to see something odd, keeping one eye on the sky and one on the live feed, but everything has been normal since that day. Later that evening, around 6:30, the power at our cabin started acting up. It wasn't a sudden outage. First, the lights flickered a few times and dimmed before everything just shut off completely, without any clicks or surges. My wife thought it was probably the wind, which had been picking up all afternoon. Given our location near Ashland, but deep enough into the woods, we were somewhat accustomed to sporadic power issues, especially during odd weather. Initially, we weren't too worried. We had flashlights, a battery-powered lantern, and one of those hand-crank radios that can also charge phones. The kids even enjoyed the adventure, likening it to camping. I made sure we were prepared, lighting the wood stove, ensuring we had enough water, and settling in to wait it out. However, by 7:15, my cell phone unexpectedly lost signal completely. Not just data, but no service bars at all, which was unusual because we would typically have at least a weak signal. I stepped outside, phone raised high, hoping for a signal, but found none. My wife's phone was the same. The kids watched, thinking I was just putting on a show. Frustrated, I grabbed our reliable handheld Garmin GPS, usually reserved for hiking, from the gear cabinet. I thought it might give us some insights, perhaps endpoint if the issue was local or more widespread. To my surprise, the GPS turned on, but wouldn't lock on to any satellites. It was as if everything electronic had decided to take a break at the same time. The cabin was surrounded by a clearing, roughly half an acre wide, not deep in the woods. Yet, when I tried to use the GPS there, it just stayed stuck on the loading screen, unable to find satellites. I waited about 5 minutes, but nothing changed. I brought the GPS inside and noticed its compass needle spinning. We keep a few old-school magnetic compasses as backups. Pulling one out, I placed it next to the GPS. This compass needle was also acting up, slowly turning clockwise instead of snapping to north. Thinking the GPS might be causing interference, I separated them, but it made no difference. I tried another compass, a different brand and model, yet it too acted strangely, pointing southeast briefly, then shifting east and wobbling again. I compared these readings against the big map on the wall and even pulled out the big orienteering compass from the emergency kit. All the compasses were acting weird, their needles drifting and eventually settling in the same direction, roughly toward the dense, marshy part of the woods behind the cabin, a place we kept the kids away from because it was too thick and strange. As I was figuring this out, my wife was busy with a flickering lantern and the kids were growing restless. I checked the windows and doors, more out of habit than anything else. Although it wasn't late, the sky had turned a cloudy gray, making it impossible to guess the time. By 8 p.m. it was pitch dark, no moon, no stars, and oddly, we couldn't even see the town lights over the ridge or spot a plane in the sky. It was eerily quiet outside. No wind, no frogs. The trees themselves seemed to hold their breath. I stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight, trying to appear calm, and scanned the tree line before glancing back at the house. Inside, I saw all 3 compasses on the table where I had left them, but now they pointed in a slightly different direction, shifted about 10 or 15 degrees to the left. They were still pointing towards the woods, but not exactly where they were before. I went back inside and turned off the lantern for a moment. I was staring out the back windows at the edge of the forest. All I could see was the dark outline of the trees against the night sky. There were no lights, no signs of movement. Everything felt unnaturally still, which made the atmosphere feel heavy and tense. As I kept looking for any hint of light, a flashlight beam perhaps, or the glow of headlights, a knock suddenly broke the silence. It came from the back wall of the house, not the door. Just a single soft tap, as if someone had casually rapped their knuckles against the wall and then paused. My wife looked up from the couch, her expression one of confusion. She had heard it too. We both froze, not moving an inch. Seconds later, another knock sounded, this time nearer to the window. I quickly grabbed a flashlight and opened the back door, shining the light across the porch and into the yard. But there was nothing out there. No footprints in the snow, no figures hiding among the trees, just an eerie stillness. I stepped outside, turning slowly to scan the surroundings. Though I saw nothing unusual, the air felt thick with a strange pressure, as if something was lurking just beyond the light's reach, invisible but palpably present. Feeling uneasy, I went back inside, locked the door, and decided it was time to talk to my wife about everything. The odd behavior of the compasses, the malfunctioning GPS, and now, the unexplained knocks. We spoke in hushed tones, mindful of the kids who were starting to sense that something was amiss. I attempted to call 911, but my phone was as useless as before. It couldn't even connect to emergency services, showing just a dead screen. By 9:12, all the compasses in the house had shifted their orientation simultaneously, now pointing about 20 degrees to the left of the clearing in the woods. We watched them turn, saying nothing, just exchanging worried glances and occasionally looking back toward the windows. At 9:38, the GPS briefly came to life, signaling a locked position with a solitary green bar that flickered on and then disappeared. The coordinates it flashed didn't make sense. They showed a location about 6 miles southeast, a remote area of the woods with no trails, roads, or buildings. Just as quickly as it had revived, the GPS lost power again, along with the lantern. Their batteries drained rapidly, and when I checked, even the kids' walkie-talkies were completely dead, not just low on power. Last fall, I went camping alone in northern Arizona near the Mogollon Rim. I often take solo trips, especially late in the season when the parks are quieter. I'm experienced and always well prepared with gear, maps, food, and an emergency beacon, so it wasn't a reckless decision. The spot I chose is quite remote, accessible only via a rough, unpaved forest road with lots of washboarding. It's not a place you'd find by accident, and there's no cell service, but that's normal for the area. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon. The weather was a bit cloudy but dry. I set up my camp about 50 yards off the road, near a tree line, but with an open view of the sky, perfect for stargazing. There was already a fire ring there, so I gathered wood, made dinner, and settled in for a quiet evening under the stars. Early in the night, I could hear small animals in the brush, but nothing alarming. At 10 p.m., I put out the fire, brushed my teeth, and crawled into my tent. The night was still, only broken by the occasional hoot of an owl and the whispers of the trees. I read for a bit on my Kindle before falling asleep. Unexpectedly, I woke up at around 2:30 a.m. There was no particular noise or disturbance. I just opened my eyes. The previous summer, my family and I had stayed at a different cabin than usual. There was an incident at our old cabin where, out of nowhere, all electronics, including lights and phones, stopped working. The GPS and landline went dead too. Surprisingly, when I checked, the batteries in the devices were brand new and tested fine later. At 10 p.m. that night, everything came back on as if nothing had happened. The landline rang, the GPS restarted, and the lights hummed back to life. However, the compasses didn't return to normal. They pointed toward the woods instead of magnetic north. This detail never left me. The next morning, I felt compelled to follow the direction the compasses indicated. I walked into the woods, past a clearing, following the strange bearings for about half a mile. There was nothing there, no trail, no signs of passage, just an unsettling, charged atmosphere. I turned back and decided that was the last time I'd bring my kids to that place. Since then, we've used a different cabin for our summer trips. The old one is still in good shape, but we've never stayed overnight again. I woke up feeling off, unsure of the time, but sensing something wasn't right. The tent was unusually cold, colder than when I'd gone to sleep. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sat up, unzipping the tent flap just enough to peek outside. In the moonlight, about 10 feet from where I was, I could see my pile of firewood, but something about it was amiss. At first glance, it appeared an animal might have tampered with it, perhaps scattering the logs. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the wood wasn't scattered at all. It was deliberately arranged into a spiral, neat, symmetric, each log and stick laid flat in a tight clockwise pattern, like a snail's shell. The logs I had propped against a tree earlier were gone. Everything was used to create this spiral. I knew this couldn't happen without me noticing. I'm a light sleeper, especially outdoors, and the dirt around was soft and dry, perfect for leaving footprints. Feeling the chill, I stepped out barefoot, armed only with my flashlight. I shone it around the spiral. The ground was smooth, undisturbed, with no traces of any presence, human, animal, or otherwise. The spiral sat there, perfectly formed, amidst the untouched dirt. Looking around, I saw nothing but the dark outline of trees and the oppressive silence. It felt surreal, like walking into a room to find everything out of place, yet meticulously organized. I stood there for what felt like forever, scanning the woods, trying to make sense of it all. Was it a prank? Some unknown animal behavior? Neither seemed plausible. Animals don't craft with such precision, and what person would arrange wood in total silence without leaving a single trace? Eventually, I couldn't leave the spiral as it was. It felt wrong to let it remain. Without much thought, I dismantled it, not bothering to restack it as before, but instead just dragging the logs back into a rough pile near the fire ring. I retreated to my tent, zipping it up securely, and lay awake until dawn, enveloped in the continuing silence, the kind that seemed to press against my ears. No wind, no rustle, nothing stirred, and as the light finally broke, I realized I had spent the whole night in alert stillness, listening to the silence. I was already up by sunrise, hastily packing my things, although I wasn't supposed to leave until the next morning. Without bothering to eat, I quickly dismantled my campsite, double-checking that I hadn't left anything behind. Before driving off, I decided to revisit the spot where I had seen the spiral the night before. The ground was still smooth, untouched, with no footprints, as if everything the night before was just my imagination. However, the logs told a different story. They were scattered, not neatly stacked as I remembered them. It was clear something had moved them silently during the night. The previous night, driven by my love for storm photography, I had been out chasing a thunderstorm. It's just a hobby, but I love the spontaneity of it. The way the sky erupts in brilliant flashes that change everything in an instant. The roads were empty, and the air was charged with the scent of impending rain, creating a serene yet electrifying atmosphere only broken by distant thunder. I pulled over, set up my camera and tripod, and began capturing the storm, which was slowly advancing about 10 miles away. For about an hour, I focused on the lightning, attempting to capture the dramatic strikes. Feeling content with the evening's work, I returned home, looking forward to reviewing the photos. The next morning, as I scanned through the images on my computer, I noticed something unusual. In 3 consecutive shots, there appeared a dark, angular shape against the stormy backdrop. Not a typical cloud shadow or a bird, but something resembling a distorted rectangle or block. It had sharp, defined edges and seemed to hover in the middle of the storm. Intrigued, I examined the original files more closely. The anomaly was present in all 3 images, captured from slightly different angles. It was peculiar that I hadn't noticed it while shooting, despite hours spent staring intently at the sky. I shared the photos with a few photographer friends, curious about their take on the mysterious shape. Some suggested it might be a camera glitch or a trick of the light, but the consistent appearance in multiple shots made that unlikely. Regardless, it remained an intriguing puzzle, adding an unexpected layer to my storm-chasing adventure. The day I was out photographing a storm, I saw something in my pictures that caught my attention. It was an odd shape, suspended in the sky, completely still. It didn't look like any lens flare or ghosting I'd ever seen, and it stayed in the exact same spot across multiple shots. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went through the photos again and again, looking for any sign of movement or a simple explanation, but found nothing. The clouds and lightning moved and flashed around it, but the shape itself never changed. Feeling puzzled, I decided to revisit the spot the next afternoon. It was a typical rural area, just trees, fields, and the sounds of birds. Nothing out of the ordinary that could explain what I'd seen in the photos. I walked around, checking the horizon and the treetops, but everything appeared normal. No strange structures or anything that could cast weird shadows or reflections. That night, driven by curiosity, I went back out to the same spot to try photographing again. I set up my camera, hoping either to catch the strange shape again or to confirm it was just a one-time anomaly. The storm behaved as usual this time, with recognizable cloud patterns and normal lightning. I saw no unusual shapes, and my camera gear was all in good order. The lens was clean, and the settings were unchanged. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. The shape didn't look natural. I know what clouds and storms are supposed to look like, and this was different. It wasn't glowing, moving, or doing anything active. It just existed in those frames. Going back over the photos, I noticed new details. The way the lightning seemed to illuminate the edges of the shape, but only slightly and not on all sides. Sometimes, it seemed like there was a faint outline extending down from it, but it was hard to make out against the dark sky. I didn't talk much about it because I didn't know what to make of it. I'm not one to jump to wild conclusions or sound paranoid. Yet, that unexplained shape lingered in my mind, a quiet puzzle from an otherwise normal day of storm chasing. I was lounging in my lawn chair one quiet Thursday night around 9:30, just enjoying the open sky and the solitude after retiring from a career in air traffic control. In New Mexico, where I used to manage the skies at a regional airport, nights without a phone or any screens are my way to unwind. The neighborhood quiets down after dark. No streetlights, just the clear sky and the outline of low hills. That night, the air was still, only a slight breeze rustling the leaves, and the sky was particularly clear, not a cloud in sight. I was casually scanning the heavens, having already spotted a few satellites, when something unusual caught my eye almost directly overhead. This black, angular shape was just floating there among the storm clouds. I was out chasing lightning on a quiet country road, the kind of night where you hear no sounds but the storm itself. The shape was too defined, too solid to be just another cloud or a shadow. At first, I thought it might be a drone or some experimental aircraft, but it showed no signs of normal aviation. No lights, no sound, no movement. Another time, I wondered if it was just an optical illusion, a trick of the storm creating an odd cloud formation or shadow. But having watched storms for many years, this was different. A few weeks after capturing those images, I was at a local coffee shop with a friend who's really into local news and oddities. As I showed him the pictures on my phone, he got hooked instantly. He suggested checking with weather stations or looking up radar data from that night. I hadn't thought of that, so I searched the radar archives. The storm I chased was there, moving as expected, but there were no odd signals, no blips, nothing unusual reported in that area that night. Still, the shape was unmistakable in 3 clear frames on my cam. It wasn't a figment of my imagination or a camera glitch. To this day, those photos are just sitting on my hard drive. I often revisit them, trying to convince myself it was all just a trick of the light or a lens error, but deep down, I'm not sure. It's unsettling, not knowing exactly what it was, and part of me isn't sure I want to know. Every now and then, that shape comes back to haunt me, the way it just hovered silently in the clouds on that stormy night. At first, I thought it was just a large bird gliding through the sky, maybe a hawk or an owl. However, its movement was odd, and the silhouette didn't match any bird. It was too big and shaped more like a wide, sharp boomerang than anything else, with 2 long wedges joined in the middle. It was also incredibly dark, even blacker than the sky, with no reflections or navigation lights. As it moved across the sky, it blocked the stars, making them disappear one moment and reappear the next as it passed. The object moved smoothly and slowly, coasting almost as if it was on rails, without any tilt or wobble. Despite the light wind coming from the northeast that night, it moved in a south-southeast direction, cutting right through the breeze. I watched it for about 15 to 20 seconds, long enough to rule out a drone, a balloon, or any bird. It was completely silent too. No engine hum, no sound of wind, nothing. At one point, I found myself standing up without even realizing it, just staring at this thing. It wasn't enormous, not like a jumbo jet, but it was definitely larger than any drone I'd seen flying that high. It had to be at least 30 or 40 feet across. Then, gradually, it just faded away. It didn't speed up or change course, just maintained its path and slowly dimmed until I couldn't see it anymore. The stars it had obscured twinkled back into view as it vanished. I stood there for a while, trying to process what I had seen. With 30 years of experience watching radar and guiding planes, I knew what aircraft looked like at night. I could identify a helicopter or a Cessna just by their sounds, but this thing didn't match anything I knew. I didn't immediately tell my wife. She was inside, likely watching a true crime show, and probably would have just rolled her eyes. So I sat back down and kept staring at the sky, half expecting, half hoping to see it again. That didn't happen, but about 10 minutes later, I heard a strange noise. It wasn't mechanical. It was more like a low resonance, something you feel rather than hear, coming in short waves about 5 or 6 seconds apart. It was a low hum, then it would disappear, then come back again. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. It was just there. As I turned around and took in the scene of the house, hills, and trees, there was nothing unusual in sight, but I sensed something odd, like the subtle vibration you feel when a heavy truck passes nearby. Suddenly, the sensation ceased without tapering off. My chest tightened, as though I was holding my breath involuntarily. It wasn't fear I felt, exactly, but a definite sense of being off-kilter, unsettled. I went back inside and sat in the dark kitchen, gazing out the window, unable to articulate or capture what I'd felt. The entity had a simple enough shape, but its silent, eerie movement was beyond my ability to describe or sketch. Later, as I lay in bed, sleep eluded me. My thoughts turned to radar. The object had made no sound, left no trail, and had no lights. I wondered if it had appeared on any local radar. Although civilian radars wouldn't detect something without a transponder, I knew some military installations nearby used passive systems that could have caught something. I thought about contacting a couple of acquaintances who worked near Cannon, but I hesitated, not wanting to be ridiculed. The following night, I sat outside again with a different dry NK, watching the sky intently for hours, but saw nothing. The next morning, however, I discovered something peculiar by the fence line. There's an old, partially collapsed wire fence at the back of the property. While checking a broken post, I found 3 small, evenly spaced indentations in the dirt, resembling narrow, pointed tripod feet. They were shallow and showed no signs of what might have made them. no footprints or tire tracks nearby, just these fresh marks arranged in a triangle. The ground was dry, yet the edges of these impressions hadn't crumbled. I touched the center of the triangle. The soil felt cooler than its surroundings, not cold, just noticeably cooler, possibly shaded by a nearby bush, but it was still peculiar. I kept these observations to myself. A few days later, driving into town just after sunset, as I rounded a long curve, the sky a fading blue, I was driving west of Kearney, Nebraska, a little after 3 a.m., having been on the road since about 9 the previous night. I was hauling refrigerated freight from Indianapolis to Salt Lake City, a pretty standard route for me along I-80. It's a long, straight, and frankly boring drive that I prefer because it's usually uneventful. The stretch of road was empty, just endless fields and sky, with only the occasional mile marker and the steady hum of the tires on the road. Though I had coffee back in Grand Island and wasn't exactly tired, I found myself zoning out with the cruise control on and the AM talk radio murmuring softly in the background. It was in this half-attentive state that I first noticed them, 3 white dots in my rearview mirror. They were all the same size and brightness, spaced evenly apart, and definitely not any ordinary vehicle headlights. At first, I thought it could be a plane, maybe coming into alignment or banking slowly. But the lights maintained a consistent distance, mile after mile, which ruled out a moving aircraft. They just hovered there, behind me, too high to be headlights, but too low and bright to be stars, especially with the moon out. I tapped the brakes lightly, just to see if it would provoke any change. They remained steadfast, about half a mile back and slightly off to the left of the road. There was no sound, no blinking, nothing that resembled typical navigation lights. Just a static, eerie float in the darkness. Then, something else caught my eye to the right, just above the ridgeline. It was a different shape, not a boomerang, but more like a flat disc. It might have been just a trick of the light, but it was hard to tell. I only caught a glimpse of it for a second before the trees blocked my view. By the time I got to a clearing, it had vanished. I pulled over and got out, staring at the horizon for a good 10 minutes, but it never reappeared. I never reported what I saw. Life went back to normal after that night. No more strange sightings, no unusual sounds, just quiet. But sometimes, when I sit out back as the wind dies down, I can't help but look up and wonder if I'll see something unexplainable again. How long had it been there before I noticed? How long had it been watching? All I could hear as I drove was the wind and the distant hum of the highway. Being on the road, you see all kinds of strange things, from drivers carelessly speeding without their lights on, to deer frozen in the headlights, and even the occasional drone. But that night was different. There was something behind me, a presence I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't behaving like anything recognizable. Was it a plane? But why would it hover so persistently right behind me? And a drone? Who would fly one in such a remote area at 3 a.m.? As I continued, I passed a small county road exit. No services, just an empty turnoff. I considered pulling over to see if whatever was behind me would follow, but something about that idea felt of map F. So I drove on. That uneasy feeling stayed with me, and after another 20 minutes, they were still trailing me. Out of curiosity, I flashed my high beams quickly, on and off, hoping for some sort of reaction. Nothing. They remained unflinching, a fixed presence that reappeared every time the road straightened after a curve. Checking the time, it was now 4:06 a.m. I told myself earlier I'd stop at the next reputable truck stop after 4 a.m. Soon after, I saw a sign for a rest area, but chose to keep driving. The thought of stepping out with those lights still looming behind didn't feel safe. Suddenly, as I glanced in my left mirror, they moved, and not just a slight shift. All 3 lights darted sideways in unison, horizontally, and at an astonishing speed, crossing the sky to hover over the open fields at an angle. They paused again, motionless as before. This sudden movement startled me enough to hit the brakes. But there, they just stopped, no jittering, no adjusting. Then, as quickly as they had moved, they shot straight upwards and vanished. Not faded, just completely disappeared. I pulled over, the truck's 4-way flashers blinking in the quiet night. With the engine still idling, I got out and walked away from the truck. The night was silent around me. No cars, no signs of life above, just the clear sky with the moon to the west and stars scattered across the rest. I stood there, staring into the emptiness for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. We had been staying at an old cabin deep in the woods, just me, my wife Sarah, and our dog Max. It was the kind of secluded spot where you're cut off from the world. No cell service, no neighbors, just surrounded by trees and engulfed in silence. We chose this place because we wanted to escape everything. The noise, the distractions. It was just us and the forest. The night before the strange occurrence, everything had been so calm. We were tired from a day of hiking and went to bed early. Max settled at the foot of our bed as he usually did. It was one of those peaceful nights where it feels like nothing could go wrong. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up feeling uneasy. The room seemed darker than usual. I reached out to check the time on my phone, but it was dead. No signal, nothing. Sarah was asleep next to me, and Max was on the floor, seemingly undisturbed. I tried to shake off the feeling and go back to sleep, but I couldn't. Eventually, I got up to get some water from the kitchen. That's when I noticed everything was amiss. The living room was in disarray. The couch had been moved about 4 feet closer to the window. The coffee table was flipped on its side, and chairs were out of place. Even a small bookshelf was turned 90 degrees. Nothing was broken or damaged, but it looked like someone had been there, moving things around. I rushed back to wake Sarah. She was groggy at first, but became concerned as I explained what was happening. Together, we checked the rest of the cabin. The kitchen table and chairs were rearranged, and the stove knobs had been tampered with. Strangely, nothing small was missing or out of place, and there were no signs of forced entry. No open doors, no broken windows, no footprints. Both the front and back doors were securely locked. The next day, as I drove the rest of the way to North Platte without stopping, the incident lingered in my mind. I was constantly checking the rear view mirrors, half expecting to see something or someone. At one point, while trying to make sense of it all, I heard the engine stutter and turned to see if I had accidentally hit something. But everything was in place. The car was still in neutral, and the brakes were set. The lights on the dash flickered once, then stabilized, and I continued on, never seeing those flickering lights again. Max spent the entire time at the foot of the bed, not making a sound, just sleeping like any other night, as if nothing was amiss. Before going to bed, we made sure everything was locked up tight. In the middle of the night, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The yard looked just as we left it, with no tracks or signs that anyone had been near. The forest around was silent, not even a breeze or the usual sounds of wildlife, and the night air was unusually heavy, almost as if it was holding its breath. Inside, the cabin felt off. The furniture wasn't where we left it. The couch and coffee table especially had moved from their usual spots. Sarah and I racked our brains, trying to recall if perhaps we'd moved things and forgotten, but that wasn't the case. We remembered exactly where we had placed each item. It was clear we hadn't rearranged anything in our sleep. We stayed up the rest of the night, listening intently for any noises, outside footsteps, indoor creaks, anything at all, but there was nothing. Only the sound of Max's steady breathing filled the silence. When morning light spilled through the windows, everything looked normal again, except the furniture was still oddly misplaced. I took photos with my phone, trying to document the bizarre situation. We even joked about ghosts, but it wasn't really humorous. The strangest part was Max's calmness. Usually, he reacts to the slightest oddity, but he remained undisturbed. Deciding not to linger, we packed up and left a day earlier than planned. As we drove away, I kept eyeing the cabin in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow move near the tree line, but it vanished when I blinked. We left with no explanation, no signs of forced entry, no damage, and no footprints. Yet it was evident that something or someone had been inside, moving things around without waking either us or Max. It felt surreal, like a dream, but the evidence was right there. Earlier that day, I had been hiking alone in a national forest, enjoying the late summer evening. It was just me and the trail, in a place remote enough where I wasn't expecting to see anyone else. I needed that solitude, a break from everything, but the hike was overshadowed by the unnerving events that unfolded later at the cabin. The day was pretty standard, with the usual sounds of birds and the rustling wind through the pine trees, accompanied by the distant buzz of insects. I took in the fresh air, distinctly scented with pine needles and earth, as I made my way up the ridge. Thankfully, the weather was on my side, with no sign of rain, and the soft light of the setting sun made everything look a bit more serene. Every so often, I'd stop to catch my breath or gaze back at the sprawling valley below. As I neared the top of the ridge, though, something didn't feel right. Normally, ridges like this catch breezes that bring with them the sounds of life, birds overhead, squirrels in the trees, but now it was eerily quiet. No breeze shook the leaves, no birds called, and not a single insect chirped. It was an unsettling silence, the kind that makes your ears ring from the lack of noise. At first, I thought it might just be a temporary lull, maybe the calm before a storm. I stood still, trying hard to pick up any natural sound, but nothing came. Then I noticed a faint hum. It was almost imperceptible at first, like background white noise, but it gradually became more distinct. Oddly, it didn't seem to come from any specific direction. It was as if the entire ridge was emitting this hum. Curious and a bit unnerved, I covered my mouth with my hand, attempting to block out the humming in hopes of catching any natural forest sound. But it persisted. The hum was low and steady, filling the air, and I began to feel a physical response, a strange buzzing in my teeth, almost as if my fillings were vibrating in response to the hum. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I scanned the surrounding area. The trees stood motionless, the sky clear, and there were no signs of wildlife. No birds, no squirrels, not even the usual rustle of branches or leaves. It was just the hum and the silence. I pulled out my phone to check the time and look for any alerts that might explain this weirdness. A weather update, anything unusual. But my phone showed no notifications and reported normal weather conditions. Surprisingly, I still had a signal, which was unexpected in such a remote location. With a growing sense of unease, I took a few cautious steps forward, the hum and the silence my only companions. I was planning to go over the ridge and keep going, but as soon as I started moving, the humming sound got louder, and my teeth began to buzz more intensely. It felt like the pressure in my head was building up. I stopped, hoping it was all just my imagination. That's when I realized something else was off. The air felt different, heavier, almost like trying to walk through water, yet there was no water around. The ground looked normal, with no strange markings or discoloration. I called out a quick hello to see if anyone was nearby, but there was no response, no echo, just an eerie silence. Standing still became more difficult as the hum filled my head, making it hard to focus, and I started feeling dizzy. Despite wanting to sit down and wait it out, I didn't want to get stuck up there. The silence felt unsettling, so I began to head back down the trail, moving slowly and cautiously. As I descended, familiar sounds began to return. First, I heard a distant bird call, then the rustle of leaves as the breeze picked up. The hum faded away slowly, like turning down a volume knob. My teeth stopped buzzing, and the pressure in my head lifted. When I reached the base of the ridge, everything seemed normal again. The forest was alive with sounds, bugs chirping, birds singing, and the wind whispering through the trees. I checked my phone and saw that about 20 minutes had passed since I reached the top of the ridge, but the memory of that strange silence and hum lingered. I later told a few people about it, but they laughed it off, suggesting it might have been my ears or some weird radio interference. Maybe they're right, or maybe it was all in my head, but that spot on the ridge felt strangely off, almost like a place caught between two worlds. I haven't gone back yet,